The Colorado sky that morning was the color of a promise nobody intended to keep, dust on Main Street. Silence where there shouldn't be silence. And behind the green shade of the post office window, a woman who hadn't sat down in 23 days was still standing. Nobody asked why. That was the thing about Redstone Crossing. Not that a terrible thing had happened inside its borders. Terrible things happened everywhere west of the Missouri. But that an entire town had looked at the evidence of it, had seen it standing upright behind an oak counter every single morning, and had decided collectively, deliberately, that looking was more expensive than they were willing to pay. They were wrong about that, because somewhere up in the San Juan Mountains, a man who had learned everything about the cost of looking away was riding down. And he wasn't stopping at the saloon. The bell above the door chimed and Martha Bowen walked in. She came in the way she always came in, filling the frame, certain of her welcome, carrying the particular authority of a woman who had never once in 50 years questioned whether a room wanted her in it. She smelled of butter and scorched sugar, which meant Bernard had let the second batch run long again while she managed the front counter. She moved to the parcel shelf without greeting and ran one finger along the wooden lip. Rose Callaway watched her from behind the oak counter and kept her hands flat on the surface and kept her face arranged into the expression she had been practicing for 23 days. The expression that said, "Everything is manageable." The expression that said, "I am the postmistress and this is my post office and I am standing here because I choose to stand here and not for any other reason." The counter was white oak, a single slab her father had hauled down from the northern pass on a borrowed mule the year before she was born. He'd mentioned it to customers for 3 years after the fact, proud of it in the way of a man who'd built something with his own effort and wanted the building to be known. The grain ran diagonal, left to right, and Rose had memorized every inch of it across the past 3 weeks. The place near the left edge worn smooth by her father's habit of resting his forearms there while he talked. The knot near the center sanded flush and stained to match. Imperfect if you looked close and seamless if you didn't. She looked close at everything now. It was the one skill the past 23 days had refined. "You look like something left out in weather," Martha said, lifting her parcel and settling it under one arm. "Customers are going to start worrying." Rose kept her voice level. "Good morning, Mrs. Bowen, I mean it. You've got circles that weren't there 2 months ago, and you're holding yourself like your back went out." A pause, the particular pause of someone who believes they are delivering a kindness. Doc Taft said it was a fall. Riding accidents heal. You push through the stiffness and it passes. Your father never made a spectacle of his discomfort, and neither should you. Here was the thing about cruelty dressed as advice. It required no malice to land precisely. Martha Bowen was not a cruel woman by any ordinary measure. She loved her husband, she made excellent bread. She'd sent food to every bereaved family in Redstone Crossing for 20 years. The cruelty was incidental, a side effect of the real thing she was doing, which was protecting herself from the version of events that would require her to act. Rose had understood this by day 4. Understanding it had not made the 23 days shorter. "Thank you for stopping in," Rose said. "Your father would have wanted you to keep things professional. He was always so. Have a good morning, Mrs. Bowen." A beat of silence that contained several things. Then the bell chimed and she was gone, and the dust settled into the particular stillness of a Thursday morning in a post office that had seen too much of it lately. Rose stood at the counter and breathed in through her nose until the thing climbing her throat went back down where she'd been keeping it for 23 days. Not crying, not here, not in front of customers, not for an audience that needed to feel better about walking past. She'd made that rule on day 2 and she'd kept it every day since, and she was going to keep it today. She pressed her palms to the oak and let the grain anchor her and thought about what was true. What was true? The pain had moved from sharp and immediate into something deeper and more structural around day 11. The kind of ache that stopped announcing itself and became the architecture of every waking hour. She had not slept in any meaningful sense since the Thursday afternoon at Miller's Creek. She had not sat down. What was also true? She was still here. The post office was still open. The chits were filed and the correspondence was sorted, and the telegraph key was operational. and every function of a federal postal station was being executed correctly by a woman who had been standing upright through damage that Doc Warren Taft had looked at directly and then chosen to misrecord. She knew what she was doing by continuing to come in each morning. She was refusing to become the abandoned building that Doyle Cole needed her to become. She was keeping the light on. It was not enough, and it was everything she had, and she was doing it anyway. The outgoing tray held one item, a parcel she'd been trying to send to her father's cousin in Cheyenne for 4 days. She'd written the accompanying letter 3 times. Each time her hand had shaken too badly to finish. The third attempt, 2 nights ago, had made it to half a page before the tremor had become too pronounced to produce legible script. She'd folded it and sealed it and told herself she'd try again in the morning. And then the morning had come, and there were customers. There were always customers. The post office was the one building in Redstone Crossing that everyone needed eventually, regardless of their position on the matter of what had happened at Miller's Creek. She was lifting the parcel to check the address label when the bell above the door chimed again. The man who came in was not a regular. Rose clocked this before she'd fully turned. 450 residents in Redstone Crossing, plus the transient population of miners and drovers cycling through the canyon camps. And she knew the regulars with the automatic recognition of a woman who had been sorting their mail since she was 15. This man registered as absence, the absence of the familiarity that attached to everyone else who came through that door. He was large in the structural way of mountains, not aggressively but load-bearingly, built for sustained effort rather than display. Buckskin that had been patched at the left shoulder with slightly mismatched thread, which meant he did his own repairs, which meant he lived where seamstresses were theoretical. A coat of cured fur, heavy enough for altitude. The smell of pine resin and wood smoke that entered the room with him said he was coming from somewhere high and had been there recently. His beard was dark going gray at the jaw, and his hands, when he set the bundle of outgoing correspondence on the counter, were the hands of decades of outdoor work, not rough for the sake of it, but shaped by consistent functional use in the way that tools are shaped by what they do. He didn't look at her immediately. She noticed that with the attention she'd been giving to everything lately. Most men coming to the counter especially eye contact first as a matter of transaction. This man looked at the bundle he'd set down, then at the telegraph coordinates list beside it, then at the service board above her head. He was orienting to the space before he addressed its occupant. It was a courtesy she hadn't encountered in a while, the specific courtesy of someone who understood that attention, uninvited, was a form of pressure. "Need these sent to Denver," he said. His voice resonated at a frequency that vibrated in the oak counter rather than projecting into the air. Telegraph coordinates are on the list. Letters go to the commercial address at the top. Rose reached for the coordination list. The movement required her to shift her weight off the right hip, which she'd been favoring since early morning, and redistribute to the left, which was further along in its damage and more reactive to transitions. The spasm that arrived through her lower back was not, by the scale of what she'd been managing, exceptional, but it arrived at the exact moment her fingers closed on the paper, and her grip went unreliable, and she caught herself on the side of the telegraph machine with more weight than she'd intended, and the sound of it, the dull contact of a body against brass, was apparently enough. The man's eyes moved to her. Not with the particular quality of the Redstone Crossing gaze she'd learned to categorize. Not the deliberate non-looking of people who knew something, and were committed to not engaging with their knowledge. Not the brief, horrified curiosity of people who wanted to see the extent of damage they'd heard about. Not the studied focus elsewhere of people who felt guilty and were managing it through absence. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand the mechanics of, level, analytical, present without theater. He didn't look away. He stood at the counter and watched her compose herself with the patience of someone who tracked things for a living and understood that the thing being observed would tell you what you needed if you let it complete itself. Rose straightened, put her weight back in its managed position, moved to the telegraph key with the precise, contained movements she'd spent 3 weeks developing. "I'll have these sent by noon, your left ankle," he said. His register hadn't changed. The skin above the boot. What made those marks? Her hand stopped on the key. The silence that followed had a specific quality. Not the silence of someone caught in a false position, because she hadn't lied, not yet. The silence of someone who has been asked, in plain and unceremonious language, the exact question that 23 days of Redstone Crossing had been bending its collective will to avoid. "A riding accident," she said, "several weeks ago. Doc Taft recorded it as a fall. I've dealt with riding accidents." He settled his forearms on the counter, and she was aware of his weight shifting, the sense of someone with no particular schedule and no apparent anxiety about how long this took. "I've seen men thrown from Greenbroke horses, dragged when a boot caught a stirrup, falls on rock, falls in water, falls onto fence posts at speed. A riding accident breaks bones above the waist, dislocates a shoulder, concusses. It doesn't leave symmetrical braided impressions on both ankles. Those marks have a pattern. 6-strand braid, consistent width, matching depth on both sides. That's not a fall. That's something tied and pulled outward with sustained directional force." Rose's hands were on the key and very still. "Who told you it was a riding accident?" he said. Not a rhetorical question. He wanted an answer. Doc Taft. She kept her voice level because she had 23 days of practice at level. "He examined me and entered it as a fall in the official record." Something moved across the man's face. Not surprise. He didn't look like a man to whom surprise happened easily, but the specific settling of a suspicion becoming a confirmed fact, a thing almost known completing itself. "How many days have you been standing?" he said. And there it was. The question shaped exactly right, in exactly that tone of flat and complete sincerity, arriving after 23 days of every person in this town asking everything except that. The architecture of the wall she'd built gave way not with drama, but with the quiet internal collapse of something that had been holding too long and was suddenly presented with an opening. 23, Rose said. "I can't sit." Since, she stopped, then started again from a different place. Since the accident. "Sitting is not possible." He was quiet for a moment, then, "My name is Samuel Briggs. I come down from the sand dunes twice a year for trade. I don't drink in the Cole family's saloon. I don't carry debts in this town. I have no obligations here that would require me to look away from what I'm looking at, Mr. Briggs. Tell me who did this." The thing she'd kept below her throat for 23 days was moving. She could feel it the way you feel weather shifting before the clouds arrive. A pressure change, the air going dense with something imminent. She'd told the true version exactly once, in Doc Taft's examination room, and Taft had heard every word and then looked at the man in the doorway and made his choice. "Even if I told you," she said, "you'd be walking into something you don't understand the shape of. The man who did this is Harland Cole. His father is Mayor Doyle Cole, who has run this town for 30 years. Doc Taft works for the mayor's interests. Deputy Lyle Marsh works for the mayor's interests. I filed a report on day 3 and it disappeared before nightfall." She looked at him steadily. "If I say the name out loud again in this building and it gets back to Doyle Cole, he'll move on the mortgage language he's been holding over this property for 2 years. There's an abandonment clause. If the postal designation lapses because the postmistress is discredited or gone, the building reverts to county jurisdiction. Which means it reverts to Cole." Samuel Briggs looked around the interior of the post office, with the same methodical attention he'd brought to everything since he'd walked in. The counter, the cubbies, the service board, the telegraph key, the door to the back room. Then he looked at her. "Lock the door," he said. Rose looked at him. "I'm not asking you to trust me," he said. "I'm asking you to give me 10 minutes in a room where nobody can walk in and require you to perform being functional while I try to understand what you're actually dealing with. After 10 minutes, if you want me gone, I'll go. But I need to see what you're carrying, and I need you to not have to manage an audience while I'm doing it." Outside, the stamp mill at the canyon mouth was running its morning rhythm. The sound of it had been the background frequency of her entire life. Low, mechanical, indifferent. Boots on the boardwalk outside. A horse being led past. A door opening somewhere down the street. Redstone Crossing conducting its Thursday morning with the same unconcerned industry it had been conducting every morning for the 23 days since Miller's Creek. Rose walked to the front door and turned the lock. She pulled the green shade down over the window glass, and the light in the room went amber and indirect. And something about the removal of the street-facing exposure, the sense of no longer being visible to everyone passing, made her aware for the first time of how much energy she'd been spending on being visible in the correct way. Being seen standing, Being seen functional. Being seen not requiring anything of anyone who might then have to decide whether to give it. She was very tired of that particular expenditure. Back room, Samuel said. He'd moved around the counter while she was at the door. She'd let him past without fully registering the decision. He was in the doorway to the small back room, looking at the supply arrangement. There's a stack of mail sacks. Lean over them at the angle the stack creates. It'll take the weight off your legs without putting pressure on your lower back. She looked at the mail sacks. She saw immediately what he meant. The slight angle of the stack would let her lean forward with her upper body supported, spine decompressed, the vertical load distributed differently than standing or sitting produced. It was a third option. She hadn't known there was a third option. For 23 days there had been standing, which was survivable, and sitting, which was not, and the binary had been the whole world. The existence of a third position, identified in 40 seconds by a man who'd been in the building for less than 5 minutes was, she didn't have a word for it. Something. She moved to the sacks and positioned herself as he'd described. The shift was immediate, not comfortable. She was not comfortable. She was a person with a significant amount of damage, and that wasn't resolving in an afternoon, but different from standing. The particular grinding taxation of standing upright against wounds that needed horizontal rest was interrupted, and the interruption was enough to make her aware of how long it had been since she'd been interrupted. Samuel pulled her father's old chair from the corner and sat in it, not close. The correct distance, tell me, he said, so she told him. She told him about the creek trail and the Thursday afternoon and the lariat. She told him about the shale. The particular quality of Colorado shale that looks smooth at distance and reveals its edges only on contact, the way the geological record of what happened was written in the parallel gouges across her lower back and hips. She told him about the distance, approximately 400 meters from where the ground changed color to where Harland Cole had cut her loose, laughing as he rode away. She told him about the 2 miles back to town and the hour it took because she'd had to stop every 100 yards and wait for the whiteout to clear. She told him about Doc Taft's examination room and the man standing in the doorway with a leather satchel on the floor beside him, and the sound the satchel made when Doyle Cole picked it up to leave. The dull clink of silver shifting against leather, a sound she'd been hearing in the quiet hours of every night since. Samuel didn't offer sounds of sympathy while she talked. He didn't reframe, redirect, or perform empathy. He listened the way a man listens when he's building something from the information, rather than deciding how to feel about it, and after a while she understood that was what she'd needed for 23 days, without having the words for it. Not pity, which required her to be a victim, not outrage on her behalf, which required her to be grateful for it. A witness. Someone paying attention to the true account and treating it as sufficient. When she finished, he was quiet for several seconds. Then he stood up, went to the supply shelf, and looked through the small medicine kit she kept there. Set it aside. He told her what he was going to do before he did it. In the practical, sequential way of someone who'd learned that warning people before you acted on them was a basic requirement. He was going to the herbalist on the north edge of town, a woman who operated outside Doyle Cole's economic sphere, and he would be back in under 15 minutes. And then he was going to spend the next 2 hours doing what Doc Taft had chosen not to do. You don't have to, Rose said. She wasn't sure why she said it. I know that, he said. He was at the back door. 3 knocks when I return. 2 quick, then 1 slow. Don't open it for anyone else. He was gone for 11 minutes. When he returned. 2 quick, 1 slow, exactly as stated. He carried a canvas bag with the unhurried purposefulness of someone who'd solved the logistics before anyone had thought to worry about them. He laid out what he'd brought on the supply shelf. Clean linen in generous lengths, a bottle of rye whiskey at sufficient proof, dried yarrow, dried usnaliken, a small batch of pine pitch mixed with raw honey that smelled of sap and something darker beneath it. He explained each item without dramatics. The whisk for initial cleaning, the usnea for its antimicrobial action against the kind of contamination that wounds carried after 3 weeks, the yarrow to manage bleeding during the cleaning process, the pine pitch mixture to seal and protect once the tissue was clean. He was describing field medicine, and he described it the way someone describes weather, as information about conditions rather than a performance of knowledge. This will hurt, he said. The whiskey especially. First application is the worst. There's a mail-sorting strap on that shelf that would serve if you need something to bite down on. She found the strap. Thick leather, worn soft by years of her father's handling. She held it in both hands while Samuel worked. He worked with the efficiency and the particular gentleness of someone who had learned both from necessity rather than instruction. Not gentle in the way of deliberate care, but gentle in the way of someone who understood that pain had costs and didn't add to it without reason. He told her what he was finding as he found it, the condition of the tissue, the places where healing had begun in good faith, and the places where contamination had interrupted it. He described things not to share them, but because she was present and deserved to know what was happening in her own body, and that quality, the assumption that she was entitled to the information, was different enough from Doc Taft's practiced incuriosity that she registered it as a distinct category of treatment. It was during the third and deepest section of damage, along her right hip where the shale had done its worst work, that Samuel's hands went still, not hesitant, still, the specific stillness of finding something that wasn't expected. He withdrew something from the wound with the fine tweezers he'd sterilized over a candle flame. Held it in the lamplight for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "Holland Cole's lariat," he said. "What color is it?" She was tired and the pain had been redistributing her attention for the better part of an hour. But she heard the change in his voice. Not the question he'd asked, but the one beneath it. The one that was already assembling something she hadn't assembled yet. "Oxblood," she said, "dark reddish-brown. He talked about it at the 4th of July social, had it made by a saddler in Denver. He said you couldn't get that particular dye west of Kansas City." Samuel held up the thing he'd removed. A fragment of braided rawhide less than an inch long, the color of old blood, deep and distinctive and utterly identifiable. It had been inside her for 23 days, because Doc Taft had looked at the wound and chosen to leave it there. The silence in the back room was a different kind of silence than anything that had preceded it. Rose looked at that small piece of material in Samuel's hand and understood that it was not just evidence. It was the literal embodiment of the choice that had been made, the choice to leave something inside a person to protect the person who'd put it there. That choice, that precise and deliberate leaving, was now extracted and sitting in clean lamplight in the palm of a man who had no debt to Doyle Cole. Samuel folded the fragment into a piece of clean linen and put it in the breast pocket of his coat with the care of someone handling something they intended to keep track of. Then he went back to work. He finished the cleaning, applied the Usna poultice to the areas of deepest concern, packing it carefully, spread the pine pitch mixture as a barrier over the wounds that needed sealing, bound her with clean linen in long, careful strips that distributed pressure without concentrating it. Every step explained, every action preceded by information about why. Why? When he was done, he told her she could lie down on her side on the cot, not sit. Lie, and the position would give her something she hadn't had since Miller's Creek. Rose lay down on her side. The relief was not subtle, and she didn't try to manage it into something smaller. The particular grinding taxation of 23 days of standing against wounds that needed horizontal rest released all at once, and she pressed her face into the thin pillow on the cot and let the shaking happen because Samuel had turned his back to restore the supply shelf to order, and she had, by any reasonable accounting, earned this. When it stopped, he was sitting in her father's chair again. He'd returned it to its original position in the corner. She hadn't mentioned where it normally lived, but he'd reconstructed it correctly from context. She noticed that, "They're not going to stop," he said. "I know, the post office is the target. Not just you, the property. Tell me about the designation." She turned her head to look at him. "How much do you know about federal postal law?" "Enough. I was a federal Army scout for 9 years. I know where local authority ends and federal jurisdiction begins, and I know that the gap between them is where men like Doyle Cole have been operating their whole careers." He looked at her steadily. "The designation," she told him. "The federal charter. The mortgage clause Doyle Cole had been holding for 2 years, waiting for leverage sufficient to use it. The abandonment provision that triggered if the postmistress vacated or was rendered non-functional. The specific machinery of the trap. Not for crude, not violent, but architectural. Built from legal language by a man who understood that the most durable kind of power was the kind you could claim you hadn't exercised. They can't compel you to sign, and they can't take the property while you're occupying it under federal designation, Samuel said. So they need you to leave voluntarily. Discrediting you accomplishes the same thing. If the record shows a woman making unfounded claims, unstable, unreliable, the land office in Denver defaults to the local authorities' account when the title is reviewed. That's been the strategy from day one, Rose said. Not take it, make me leave it. Which is why you're not leaving it, Samuel said. Not encouragement, not a speech about strength or character. Just the flat statement of a fact that had already been decided, delivered at the same register as everything else he said, as information about conditions rather than motivation. There's a U.S. Marshal named Reed Carver working out of Denver. I know him from my time with the Federal Army. He's dealt with 3 land fraud cases in Colorado in the past 2 years, and he doesn't belong to anyone's economic interests. He paused. If we send him a telegram from your federal key, from the postmistress, using the official routing, with the physical evidence we now have, and a signed medical statement from Taft, he will come. Doc Taft won't sign anything. He will, Samuel said. By the time I've finished speaking with him, Rose looked at him. Not with doubt, exactly. She'd watched this man work for the past 2 hours, and she understood that his certainty was not performance, it was assessment. He was describing what he expected to find, the way he'd described the medicine before he used it. He has a son, she said. They hold leverage over his son. That's how they kept him compliant, I know, Samuel said. And I'm going to explain to him what that leverage is worth when Reed Carver walks into Redstone Crossing with federal authority. He stood up. Stay here. Bar the back door. 2 quick, 1 slow when I return. He was at the door when the heavy knocking struck the front of the building. 3 blows, deliberate. The particular cadence of someone using the knock itself as a message before the door opened. Deputy Lyle Marsh's voice came through the wood and the green shade. Rose Callaway. Mayor Vane wants to know why this office is closed during posted hours. There's a man on the premises and the mayor considers that a matter of public concern. Open this door. Rose looked at Samuel. Samuel was already moving toward the front room. He looked back at her once, not reassurance, not bravado. Just, stay there. I have this, the same quality of information about conditions. She heard the deadbolt release, the door swing open, Marsh beginning his prepared statement, and then Samuel's voice and the sound of the following 4 seconds, which were brief and conclusive, and apparently educational for everyone involved. Deputy Lyle Marsh had not, in 11 years of wearing a badge in Redstone Crossing, been lifted off the ground by another man's grip on his lapels. He discovered, in the approximately 4 seconds the experience lasted, that it was worse than he would have imagined. Not primarily the physical aspect, though that was its own lesson, but the public aspect. The sound of it traveling down the street, the heads turning on the boardwalk. The woman outside the dry goods store with a basket who stopped walking and simply watched, which meant that by supper time this story would be in every household in Redstone Crossing. And none of those versions would include the phrase, Lyle Marsh handled the situation. Samuel had moved the way certain things move, loaded, contained, and then not contained, the whole sequence complete before anyone had time to process it was happening. He'd opened the door, and Marsh had started his statement, and somewhere in the gap between the 2nd and 5th word of that statement, Marsh had found himself at an altitude that was not natural to him. Looking at the street from a man's face at a distance of approximately 3 inches, the 2 men Marsh had brought, Cutter and the one they called Pidge, made the assessments available to them and arrived at identical conclusions by separate routes. Cutter's hand started toward his holster and stopped there, resting on the grip without completing any further motion. Pidge took 1 step backward and became very still. The post office operates under federal charter, Samuel said, at his normal register, the register of a man discussing logistics. The postmistress is a federal employee and the building is federal property. If Mayor Cole has a concern about operations here, he can address it in writing to the United States Postal Service regional office in Denver. Their response time runs to 6 or 8 weeks, a pause that wasn't long enough to be comfortable. Tell him that. Those exact words. Marsh found the boardwalk again. He looked at his own hand on the holster grip. He looked at Cutter, who had developed an intense interest in the middle distance. He looked at Samuel, who was standing in the open doorway with the canvas bag over one shoulder and the expression of a man who had completed a task and was waiting to identify the next one. You don't know what you're stepping into, Marsh said. Because 11 years of the badge required something. I know exactly what I'm stepping into, Samuel said, the same way he'd said everything else. Not raised, not sharp, not performing. Just the information, at the velocity it required. That's why I'm stepping into it. Marsh left, Cutter left. Pidge, having technically never fully arrived, completed his departure. Samuel stood in the doorway for a moment longer, watching the street resume its ordinary presentation. The woman with the basket had moved on, but slowly and not without looking back. He came back inside and closed the door without bolting it, because bolting it now would communicate the wrong thing to anyone who was watching the building, and someone was always watching the building, and he'd thought that far ahead already, which told Rose something additional about how he operated. He came to the back room doorway, looked at her. Marsh is going to the saloon to report, he said, which means Cole knows about this morning within the hour. That compresses our window for the next moves. He picked up the canvas bag. Stay here. I need to see Taft before Cole reaches him first. Rose pushed herself upright on the cot. I'm going to get the property deed while you're gone. There's a copy in a false bottom in the supply cabinet. My father put it there 4 years ago when Cole first started making noises about the mortgage. The federal designation stamp is on it. Samuel paused, looked at her with a slight recalibration, not surprise but the update of an assessment. Good, get it, keep it on your person. He was at the door, 2 quick, 1 slow, then he was gone, and Rose was alone in the back room of her father's post office on a Thursday morning in August 1881, and for the first time in 23 days she was lying down, and the wounds on her body were clean, and the fragment of oxblood lariat was in a man's breast pocket and not in her hip, and the specific helplessness that had been the architecture of every previous day was not the same as it had been an hour ago. She got up, retrieved the deed from the false bottom of the supply cabinet where her father had hidden it with the quiet foresight of a man who'd watched Doyle Cole long enough to understand what he was eventually going to do. The federal designation stamp was in the upper right corner, clear and official, and belonging to a jurisdiction that Doyle Cole had no jurisdiction over. She folded it and put it in the interior pocket of her coat. Then she sat down on the edge of her father's chair and waited. She wasn't good at waiting. She'd been waiting for 23 days, and she hadn't gotten better at it. She'd just gotten practiced at filling the waiting with the work of staying upright and functional. Now that she could sit, now that the most immediate physical crisis had been interrupted, the waiting had a different texture, not endurance but anticipation, which was harder in some ways because anticipation required her to believe in the possibility of a different outcome, and 23 days had made belief expensive. She believed anyway. She couldn't entirely explain why. Something in the way Samuel Briggs had looked at her ankle and asked his technical question with no theater in it whatsoever. Something in the way he'd put the lariat fragment in his pocket. 14 minutes after he left, the 2 quick 1 slow knock came at the back door. He came in carrying a signed document. Rose could see it in his face before he said anything. The slight compression of something that had been effortful resolving into completion. He set the canvas bag on the supply shelf and produced the folded paper from his interior pocket and laid it on the counter, and she picked it up and read it. Look, Warren Taft's handwriting, 11 minutes worth. His professional assessment, the condition of the tissue, the nature of the injuries, the presence of the foreign material, the lariat fragment that he had identified during examination and not removed, the notation in plain medical language, that the injuries were entirely consistent with being dragged by an animal at speed over rocky terrain and entirely inconsistent with a fall from a stationary or moving horse. His signature, the date of the original examination, the date of this statement. She read it twice, then she folded it and held it. His son, she said. His son borrowed against a land claim 2 years ago, Samuel said. The collateral was Taft's practice. Doyle Cole has been holding the note. I explained to him that Cole's leverage over the note only functions as long as Cole has local authority, and that Reed Carver's arrival changes the nature of every financial instrument Doyle Cole currently holds as a weapon. He paused. I also explained what he'd become if Rose Callaway died from a preventable infection while he held evidence of the attack in his filing cabinet. What did he say? He picked up the pen. The morning outside the post office was moving into its middle hours. the particular quality of light that came through the shade around 11 o'clock, warm and established, the day committed to itself. Rose thought about what she was holding, the lariat fragment in Samuel's pocket, Taft's signed statement in her hands, the deed in her coat. "There's something else," Samuel said. He told her about Jesse Harding, 14 years old, livery work since he was 10. Had been at the edge of the road when Rose came back through town that Thursday evening, had tried to help, had been stopped by Harlan Cole's instruction. Had kept quiet since because the Cole family boarded 4 horses at his father's livery, and the arithmetic of intervention was not survivable for a 14-year-old who'd been told it wasn't his business. He found something, Samuel said, a page from Harlan Cole's pocket calendar, day of the attack. In Harlan's handwriting, he told her what it said. She was quiet for a moment. He wrote it down, she said. Not a question. The particular quality of disbelief that attaches to arrogance. The arrogance of a man so certain of consequence-free behavior that he'd scheduled it. He wrote it down, Samuel confirmed. Jesse's been carrying it for 3 weeks not knowing what to do with it. He gave it to me outside the back gate of the livery. I have it here. He produced the folded calendar page and set it beside Taft's statement. Rose looked at the 2 documents on the counter beside each other, the signed medical statement and the handwritten calendar notation, together with the physical fragment of lariat, which was already evidence of premeditation by virtue of its distinctive provenance. They constituted something that Reed Carver could not be asked to ignore. "I need to send the telegram," she said. "Yes, and you need to send it now, before Cole's next move arrives." He looked toward the front room. "Can you sit at the key?" "I can," she said it without elaboration, because the answer was yes, and it had been yes since approximately 40 minutes after Samuel had finished with the binding. And that single fact, that she could sit, was something she was not going to diminish by qualifying it. She went to the key. The telegraph key was the same key she'd been operating since she was 15. Learning the codes from her father on slow Sunday afternoons when the office was empty. And the mountains were doing the particular thing they did on summer afternoons with the light angling in from the west. She knew it the way she knew the oak grain, completely without having to think. Her fingers found their positions automatically. "Reed Carver," she said. "Denver Marshal's office. Federal routing prefix is F7 on the Colorado circuit," Samuel said, from beside her. Not hovering, present at the right distance, available without pressing. Then the standard address block. Rose sent the prefix, the address. Then she stopped for 3 seconds, not from hesitation, but from the awareness of what the next words would constitute. The first true public record of Miller's Creek. The first version of events existing somewhere outside the particular silence of Redstone Crossing's collective decision not to know. Every previous telling had been absorbed and discredited and buried. The report that disappeared, the examination room where Taft had made his choice, the 23 mornings of standing behind the counter, while people collected their mail and did not ask the real question. This was different. This was a federal circuit. This moved at the speed of electricity and arrived in the hands of a man who worked for a jurisdiction that predated and superseded Doyle Cole's 30-year investment in controlling this particular piece of Colorado. She tapped the message. Rose Callaway, postmistress, Redstone Crossing, Colorado Territory, reporting felony assault with physical evidence secured, medical documentation signed and witnessed. Written premeditation evidence obtained, minor witness available. Perpetrator, Harlan Cole, requesting immediate federal investigation under postal protection statutes and territorial criminal law. Contact Samuel Briggs, San Juan sector for field coordination. She sent it. The machine ticked through its confirmation sequence. Received, moving, gone into the wire and traveling south toward Denver at the speed that had always seemed miraculous to her, even after years of operating the key. Done. She lifted her hands. Her right hand, the one that had been shaking too badly to finish a letter for 4 nights running, was steady. Both hands were steady. The tremor that had been running through her since Miller's Creek, the constant low-frequency vibration of a body operating in sustained emergency, had dropped below the threshold of visible, not gone. Below visible, which was different and sufficient. She was about to speak when the front window shutter took the impact. Not glass. The wood struck hard from outside, cracking along one hinge and swinging inward at an angle. The sound of it hit the room before she'd finished processing the silence that should have preceded it, and Samuel had her behind the counter in the same motion, the same trap spring efficiency, and from behind the counter she heard Harlan Cole's voice from the street outside. He was not attempting discretion. Callaway, clear through the broken shutter, meant to carry. I know what you just sent. Come out here and we settle this before it gets bigger than it needs to be. My father is a patient man. I am less patient. You have about 2 minutes to decide which version of the next week you want. Rose had her palm flat on the floor behind the counter, on the pine boards her father had laid. The building that was hers and had always been hers and was going to remain hers. Samuel was beside her, not touching her, giving her the operational space the situation required. He was looking at the angle of the broken shutter through a line that didn't expose their position. Him and 2 others, he said quietly. Neither of them are the men from this morning, new hires. He moved fast, which meant Marsh had reported, Cole had escalated, and Harlan had moved to the next register of available options. Not the legal architecture his father preferred, but the direct intervention that was Harlan's natural mode. The difference between Doyle Cole and his son was the difference between a patient man who built traps and an impatient man who kicked doors. And right now the impatient man was standing in the street in front of a post office that sat under federal designation, which meant that every action he took in the next 5 minutes was compounding the original charge. He's compounding, Rose said. Yes, Samuel said. Every second he stands there shouting is evidence. Yes. We don't open the door. We absolutely do not open the door. Harlan called her name again, then at a lower register, aimed specifically at the gap in the broken shutter. You think one telegram changes anything? My father built this town. You think a trapper who comes through twice a year and a woman who can barely stand up are going to walk into what my father built and... Your father built something on a foundation that you just helped us document, Samuel said, at a volume that carried clearly through the shutter gap. We appreciate the contribution. The silence from outside was the silence of someone recalibrating. Then boots on the boardwalk, 3 sets, moving away, not running, retreating, which was different. Retreating meant strategic, meant they'd gone to regroup, meant the immediate threat had a timeline rather than an immediate conclusion. Rose sat up from behind the counter, on her own without assistance, with only the managed pull of healing tissue that she had practiced navigating. She looked at the broken shutter, wood cracked at the hinge, one slat hanging at an angle. Afternoon light coming through the gap in a long, bright line across the pine floor. She looked at the telegraph key, which had done what it was built to do. She looked at Samuel, who was looking at the street through the shutter gap, with the expression of a man accounting for what had just happened and indexing it against what came next. We need to leave tonight, he said, without turning. Not because we've lost this ground, we've gained it. Because holding it requires being somewhere they can't reach us while Carver makes his way here. Trying to hold the post office through whatever Doyle Cole sends next, without federal authority physically present, puts you in the position of having to win the same fight every day. The San Juans, 3 days up. Terrain I know entirely. They don't. He turned from the window. Carver will take 2 to 3 weeks. We need to be up before Cole's next move arrives, which based on Harlan's performance just now will be organized and funded. Rose stood at her father's counter, both palms flat on the oak, the diagonal grain running left to right under her hands. She thought about what leaving meant and what it didn't mean. Leaving was not the same as abandoning. She was not leaving because she was afraid or defeated. She was moving to the position that let her return, the position that put the mountain between her and the next hired men, that gave Reed Carver somewhere to come to, that kept the evidence secure and the witness alive until the federal machinery arrived to do what it was designed for. She took a closure form from the supply shelf and wrote in her clearest hand. By order of the postmistress, this office is temporarily closed pending federal review. All official correspondence to be held for federal routing. Rose Callaway, postmistress, Redstone Crossing, CO. She pinned it to the inside of the door, visible through the intact glass. Samuel was at the back door. Do you need time? She looked around the main room one more time. The cubbies, the telegram forms in their neat stack, the telegraph key in its cradle, having done what it was built for. No, she said. They went out the back, into the alley, into the August afternoon that didn't care about any of it. long and gold and indifferent, the way Colorado afternoons were indifferent to everything except their own enormous light. Martha Bowen was at the mouth of the alley. She was standing there with her basket over one arm, and whether she'd been returning from somewhere or going somewhere or simply watching was unclear. But she was there, and she looked at Rose directly, not through her, not past her, not with the practiced unfocus that the past 3 weeks had catalogued in Rose's memory as the face of a town deciding not to see. She looked at her with the expression of a woman arriving, late and at cost, at a version of events she'd been keeping herself from. Rose met her eyes. Martha Bowen did something Rose could not have predicted. She stepped aside, not just to allow passage, but fully aside, back to the alley wall, and she looked at the ground, which was the most specific available language for something that couldn't be said and needed to be said anyway. A woman making her body communicate what she had not been willing to make her voice communicate for 3 weeks. Rose walked past her without speaking. Because there were things you could accept and things that required more distance before you could determine what they were. And this half-made acknowledgement from a woman who had told her to push through the stiffness was something that needed to be considered from somewhere that wasn't this alley on this particular afternoon. The wagon was under the pine overhang behind the livery, where Samuel had staged it that morning before coming to the post office. Jesse Harding was in the adjacent stall with a rake, doing the specific ordinary task that gave him a reason to be exactly where he was. He looked up when they came through the gate. Looked at Samuel, looked at Rose. When a man in a grey duster with a federal badge comes through that gate, Samuel said, "You tell him what you told me. Everything, the date, the time, what you saw, what you heard Harland Cole say, and the paper you found. Not more than that, not less. The true thing, the complete thing." Jesse's jaw worked. "My dad's livery will be fine," Samuel said. Because the man who's been using the Coalfields Bean fees as leverage to keep witnesses quiet is going to have significantly more pressing concerns within the month. File a claim for the outstanding boarding fees with the federal proceeding. Carver's office will have the forms. He paused. The man who told you this wasn't your business was wrong. You know that. Act like it when it counts. Jess nodded. Once. With the posture of someone deciding something, they drove out the back of the livery, north on the service road that ran parallel to Main Street before cutting west toward the canyon mouth and the long grade up into the San Juan Mountains. Redstone Crossing fell behind them in stages, the stamp mill's sound diminishing by degrees, the smell of coal smoke thinning, the density of human settlement giving way to rock and pine, and the high blue sky of a Colorado August that didn't know or care what had happened in it. Rose sat in the wagon bed on the arrangement of bare pelts. Samuel had positioned to distribute weight away from the damaged areas. She watched the town shrink in the afternoon light. She thought about the telegram moving through the circuit toward Denver, about the signed statement in Samuel's breast pocket, about Jesse Harding in the livery with his rake deciding. She thought about her father's chair in the back room, the one Samuel had returned to its correct position without being told where it went. She thought about the counter, the oak grain running left to right, the knot stained to match. She'd come back to it. That wasn't a hope or an intention. It was the fact of the matter, the thing that had already been established, and she was moving through the steps that led to it. The mountains got larger as the town got smaller. That was the mathematics of perspective, simple, obvious, and entirely different to experience from inside than to understand from outside it. She was inside it now, and the difference was the whole thing. "Sleep if you can," Samuel said from the front of the wagon. "I haven't slept properly in 23 days. You have binding and cleared wounds and you're not standing," he said. "The conditions have changed. Your body knows the conditions even when your head is still running the old math." Rose lay down on her side in the bare pelts and looked at the sky above the wagon. The unreasonable blue of high altitude in late summer, the kind of blue that looked deliberately excessive, more color than the situation required. She closed her eyes. She didn't sleep. But she stopped calculating for a while, and the wagon moved through the August afternoon, and the mountains came up around them, and somewhere behind them and to the south, in the direction of Denver, a piece of information was traveling at the speed of electricity toward a man named Reed Carver, who had, by all available accounts, never once been for sale. That was enough. For right now on this road in this light, that was enough. The first day up was the hardest, and not for the reason Rose expected. She'd anticipated the physical difficulty. The grade was steep from the canyon mouth onward, the wagon working hard against the switchbacks, her body managing the motion against the new binding. She'd anticipated the altitude, the way the air thinned by increments as they climbed and made each breath a slightly more deliberate act than the one before it. She'd anticipated the cold that arrived without warning around 4,000 feet, the temperature dropping in a way that had nothing to do with the hour, just the elevation claiming its conditions. What she hadn't anticipated was the silence. Not quiet. The mountains weren't quiet. Wind through the pines made a constant shifting sound, different from low country wind, each tree audible individually rather than the collective roar of a forest below the tree line. Creek water moving over rock somewhere below the trail. The horse working against the grade, the wagon iron wheels finding the irregularities in the packed earth. The ravens moving ahead of them in stages, lifting and resettling in the canopy as the wagon passed, but underneath all of that, an absence. The absence of the stamp mill, the absence of boots on boardwalk, the absence of voices carrying between buildings and the particular acoustic texture of a human settlement conducting its business. She'd lived inside that texture her entire life, and she hadn't known she was living inside it until it was gone, and the removal of it produced something she couldn't immediately name. Not relief, not grief, but the disorientation of a removed weight, the body still compensating for a load that was no longer there. Samuel drove without commentary. He navigated the switchbacks with the ease of someone who'd made this specific ascent, enough times that his hands knew the adjustments before his mind named them. And he left her alone with the disorientation and the mountains and the thinning air, which was the correct thing to do, and she appreciated it without saying so. They camped at 6,000 feet, where the trail leveled briefly on a granite shelf before the next long grade. Samuel built a fire in the deliberate way of someone who understood fire as a system rather than an event. The structure of it, the placement, the fuel selection for sustained heat rather than quick burn. He prepared food from the dried stores in the wagon with the same systematic attention. Nothing was wasted, nothing was approximate. They ate beside the fire and the darkness came down around them with the specific quality of mountain darkness, which had more density to it than valley dark, more of the sky's actual depth present and visible. "Tell me about Alice," Rose said. He didn't stop what he was doing. He was cleaning the tin cups with a scrap of cloth, the task of someone keeping his hands occupied while his mind went somewhere else. The fire moved between them and the darkness pressed in at the edges, and the mountains were enormous and indifferent in every direction. "She was 24 when I met her," he said. "Schoolteacher in a town called Burden Creek, Wyoming. She'd grown up there, knew everyone, considered knowing everyone a form of responsibility rather than a social habit." He set the cups down. "I was 31 and I'd been scouting for the Federal Army for 9 years. And I knew terrain better than I knew people, and I'd convinced myself that was a complete way to live. That a man who could read a mountain had everything he needed." A pause. "She changed my mind about that. She thought about problems from a direction I'd never used. I thought in landscape, exits, elevations, cover, exposure. She thought in people, who needed what, who was afraid of what someone's behavior meant about the pressure they were under. Between us we could generally figure out what was happening." The fire settled. Rose was very still. 1876, Samuel said. "I was on a federal scouting assignment, gone 6 weeks. She was alone in the house we'd built outside Burden Creek." He picked up one of the cleaned cups and turned it in his hands without looking at it. "A man named Culver ran the largest cattle operation in that county. He wanted our land for water access rights. He sent men to negotiate. Negotiating didn't produce what he wanted. He sent men to do something else." A pause that had weight in it. "She went to 4 people. The county sheriff, the land office clerk, the circuit judge who came through twice a year, and the woman who'd run the boarding house since Alice was 5 years old, who had known her since before she could walk. All 4 of them chose Culver," Rose said. "All 4 of them chose Culver." He set the cup down. "She died 3 weeks later, from wounds that weren't treated because no one with the means to treat them chose to use those means. I came back from assignment to a grave marker and 4 people in that town who couldn't meet my eyes." He looked at the fire. "I spent a month trying to decide what to do with that. Then I came up here. I've been up here since. 5 years. 5 years of deciding that the calculation was simple. The higher you are, the fewer things can reach you. And the fewer things that reach you, the less you lose. He looked at her across the fire. That's not wisdom. That's just mathematics without enough variables. Rose looked at the fire between them, at the way the light moved across his face and showed the thing that was usually contained there. Not hidden, but held. The way certain kinds of knowledge are held because putting them down completely is not an available option, and carrying them requires both hands. You came back into town, she said. I come down twice a year. For supplies, a pause. I told myself that was the only reason, and now, he was quiet for long enough that she thought the question might not be one he'd answer tonight. Then, now I think a sufficient answer and a complete one are different things, and I've been confusing them for 5 years. He looked at her steadily across the fire, with the directness that had been his default since the moment he'd walked into the post office, and not looked at her immediately as a courtesy. And I think I knew that before I left Redstone Crossing this morning, and the knowing is why I'm revising the schedule. She held his gaze. The fire moved, the mountains held their positions. The darkness above them was full of stars at this altitude, more stars than the valley showed, the sky revealing its actual depth. Alice would have read every telegram, she said. Something shifted in his face. Not collapse, the adjustment of something that had been braced for impact, and found instead a different kind of contact. She would have, he said, and she would have known everyone's business within a week and managed it like it was her personal responsibility. It is everyone's responsibility, Rose said. That's what my father thought. Information is what a community is made of. Who knows what, who can be reached, who needs what. The post office isn't a building, it's the connective tissue. She looked at the fire. That's what Doyle Cole is actually trying to take, not the real estate. The function. Samuel was quiet for a moment. Your father would have liked that framing, my father said it first. I've been trying to live up to it. She paused. He would have made his assessment of you in about 30 seconds. What assessment? That you'd seen enough of what people do wrong, that you'd gotten very clear about what you wanted to do right. She met his eyes. He would have been correct. The fire burned down and they let it. The night settled and the mountains stood in their darkness, and somewhere far below, Redstone Crossing was doing whatever Redstone Crossing was doing, which was entirely separate from this fire on this granite shelf at 6,000 feet and had no claim on the next several hours. Rose slept, not all of it. Not the full night without interruption, she wasn't there yet. But in real intervals that left her actually rested, her body using the rest she'd given it, the way her body had been trying to rest for 23 days and had been prevented. Each time she woke, she was aware of the quiet and the altitude and the absence of the stamp mill's heartbeat, and each time she found she could return to sleep, which she did. In the morning the mountains were enormous and snow-capped and entirely indifferent, and the air tasted of pine and something mineral and distant. And her binding was intact and the wounds on her back and hip were doing what properly cleaned wounds did, which was begin the long, patient work of closing. The second day the grade steepened and the trees changed. Below 6,000 feet the forest was mixed. Pine and aspen and scrub oak, the vegetation of a mountain that still had commerce with the lower world. Above it the spruce moved in and took over, dense and consistent, the canopy closing overhead and turning the trail into a corridor of filtered green light. The air carried more resin and less dust. The sound of the creek system below them grew distinct, and then faded as they climbed away from it. Samuel drove with the same unhurried competence as the day before, and Rose sat in the wagon bed and watched the terrain change, and felt her body doing its accounting. The fever that had been running through her since day 8, a low constant burn that she'd managed by not acknowledging it, was pulling back, not gone, but retreating. The infection that had been building toward a conclusion she hadn't let herself think about too. Directly now interrupted by what Samuel had done in the back room of the post office. The withdrawal of the fever was almost as disorienting as its presence had been, the way the removal of any sustained condition left the body briefly uncertain of its own baseline. At midday they stopped at a spring that came out of the rock face on the trail's uphill side. Samuel refilled the water stores and checked the horse, and looked at the sky with the attention of someone reading it for information rather than atmosphere. Rain tonight, he said. High passes. We'll camp before the tree line break. You read weather from the sky. I read weather from what's moving in it. He was restoring the water stoppers with efficient hands. The ravens this morning were flying at an angle to the wind rather than with it. That's pressure change. The spruce crowns have been shifting east since an hour ago, which means the leading edge of something is 40 miles out. He looked at her. 9 years in terrain, you learn to listen to what's already happening. And people, Rose said. You said Alice thought in people. He looked at her for a moment. The question was obvious. She'd connected it deliberately. I'm learning, he said. It came out without defense and without performance, the simple accounting of a man who knew the difference between competence and completion. I'm slower at it than she was. But I'm learning. They drove on. The rain arrived at dusk, exactly when he'd said, a high-altitude rain that was more cold than wet, the drops small and sharp, and they made camp under the natural shelter of a granite overhang that Samuel had clearly used before. There were old fire rings, a caching arrangement for supplies built into a crevice in the rock face. He had the tent canvas up before the rain became serious, and the fire going in the ring with wood from the cache that had been left dry. Rose sat inside the shelter and felt the rain on the canvas above her and ate the food Samuel produced from the supply stores and thought about Redstone Crossing. 2 days below them, doing whatever it was doing. She thought about the telegram moving toward Denver. She thought about Jesse Harding with his rake and his father's livery, and his 4-word testimony waiting to be spoken to the right person. She thought about Doyle Cole sitting in the town hall with his 30 years of accumulated local power and the knowledge that the machinery he'd been running his whole career had just developed a component he hadn't manufactured and couldn't purchase. What do you think he does next, she said. Samuel was at the fire, adjusting the draft. He has 2 categories of available action. He can work through his existing legal architecture, mortgage language, property claims, official channels, and try to discredit the evidence before Carver arrives. Or he can move outside his legal architecture entirely and attempt to eliminate the evidence directly. He paused. His preference will be the legal route. That's always been his preference. It's slower, but it leaves less exposure. Another pause. Harlan's preference will be the direct route. Harland doesn't have the patience for legal architecture, so the question is which of them drives the decision. The question is how afraid Doyle Cole is. Afraid men make decisions that match their fear, not their competence. He turned from the fire. The telegram was addressed from the postmistress of a federal station using the official routing header. That's not something Doyle Cole can make disappear. He can contest it, delay it, attempt to discredit it. But he can't make it not have happened. He knows that. The question is whether knowing it makes him more careful or less. Rose thought about the sound of the leather satchel being picked up in Doc Taft's examination room, the dull clink of silver shifting against leather. A man collecting a transaction. A man accustomed to being able to purchase whatever outcome he required. Less, she said. The men who've been purchasing outcomes their whole lives. When purchasing stops working, they don't become more careful. They become more panicked. They do the thing they've always done except harder. And the thing they've always done harder is spend money on people who will take direct action. She looked at Samuel. He's going to send someone up here. Yes, Samuel said. Which is why we've spent 3 days establishing our position before they could establish theirs. She understood then, not the general shape of it, which she'd had since he'd said San Juan's. But the specific shape. The 3 days hadn't been retreat. They'd been preparation. The terrain he knew entirely. The terrain they didn't. She thought about his 9 years of reading landscape and understood that the cabin above them was not a destination but a fortification. And the 3 days of climbing were not time spent in transit but time spent in construction. How long have you been planning this? She said. Since I looked at the marks on your ankles, he said. When the problem became clear, the available solutions became clear. I don't plan differently under pressure than I do without it. I just plan faster. The rain on the canvas had a rhythm to it, steady and indifferent. Below them the mountains fell away in shelves toward the valley. Above them the pass and the ridge and the cabin that Samuel had spent 7 years building into a position. She slept again, better this time, longer. On the 3rd day they reached the cabin. It appeared in a break in the spruce at 8,000 feet on a spur ridge that offered the specific combination of shelter and visibility that a man who'd spent his career reading terrain would have identified as optimal. Dense growth on 3 sides, granite drop on the 4th, and a view down the valley that let you see movement on the access slope from a mile below. The cabin itself was hand-hewn log, tightly fitted, the roof pitched for snow load. The door hung true. There were no gaps in the walls and no decorative elements of any kind. Rose looked at it from the wagon and understood that it had been built by someone who was not building a home, but building a position. Every decision in its construction was about function, and the function was survival in terrain that other people found inhospitable. And the result was something that wasn't comfortable but was, in a specific and important way, correct inside. A sleeping platform along the north wall, a small iron stove with a good draft, a workbench along the east wall with organized tools and supply stores, a single pine chair with a rawhide seat near the stove. On a low shelf beside the sleeping platform, in the particular placement of something that had a specific non-negotiable location, was a framed photograph. A woman standing in front of rows of sunflowers, caught mid-law, the kind of laugh that required both the body and the face. The sunflowers were taller than her shoulders. She was looking at whoever held the camera with an expression of uncomplicated happiness. Rose looked at the photograph for a moment. Then she put her pack against the south wall and didn't ask about it. The first morning in the cabin, she lay on the sleeping platform on her left side and let her body do what it had been trying to do for 23 days. Not sleep, not immediately. Her system was still running the old patterns, still expecting the next thing to require management. But rest. The horizontal rest of a body that has had its wounds cleaned and bound and been given the conditions it needed, and was now, cautiously, beginning to believe the conditions might last. Samuel brought broth at midday, venison from dried stores reconstituted with snowmelt water, plain and hot and entirely sufficient. He set it on the shelf without ceremony and went to the workbench and gave her the privacy of not watching her receive it. She drank it slowly and felt the warmth go through her in layers, each one finding a different version of cold that had been living in her without full acknowledgement. "The infection is pulling back," he said from the workbench. He'd changed her binding that morning, the assessment thorough and efficient as everything he did. "The tissue has color. Another 4 days and I'll know for certain it's going in the right direction. But the indicators are good. How long total? 2 weeks for significant healing? Another week after that before you're fully mobile without managing the movement." He was sorting through the workbench tools, organizing by some logic she couldn't see from across the room. "Carver takes 2 to 3 weeks from the telegram. That puts his arrival at approximately the same time you're fully mobile, which is not a coincidence. I planned for that margin. You planned for that margin before you'd sent the telegram." "Before we'd sent it," he said. The correction was mild and matter-of-fact, not emphasizing it. Yes, the margin was part of the calculation from the start. She thought about that. About the particular quality of a mind that builds contingency into its plans before the plans are required. That looks at a problem and sees not only the immediate solution but the downstream shape of the solution's consequences and accounts for them simultaneously. It was the mind of someone who'd learned at high cost what happens when you plan only one move ahead. "Your father taught you the telegraph," he said. A shift. Not a change of subject. He'd been listening to her earlier statement about the post office and was following a thread. "Sunday afternoons," she said, "when the traffic was light. He said everyone who worked in the post office should know how to operate every piece of equipment in it. That was his principle, no single point of failure. If something happened to him, the function had to continue. Did he know something would happen to him? She considered that. I think he knew something would happen eventually, to anyone. He thought about continuity the way you think about water storage or firewood. Not because you expect the crisis, but because the crisis comes regardless of expectation, and you'd rather have prepared." She paused. "He was right about that in the end. He got sick quickly and went quickly, and I was 20 and I became the postmistress because the function needed continuing and I was the one there to continue it." Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then, "He sounds like a man who built things to outlast him." "That was exactly what he was," Rose said, and the past tense of it landed with its usual weight. Not sharp anymore, just present, the way losses become present rather than acute after enough time. The counter, the false bottom cabinet. the designation he fought the land office to maintain when Cole first started making noises about the mortgage. He built each of those things knowing he might not be there to defend them himself. She looked at the ceiling. He would have built a better case than I did. He didn't get dragged through shale, Samuel said. She looked across the room at him. He was still at the workbench, not looking at her, hands moving through the tool organization with their habitual purposefulness. No, she said. He didn't. A pause. I sometimes think if I'd done something differently, on the trail, said something to Harland before that's the wrong question, Samuel said. He said it directly, no softening. The right question is what Harland Cole did, and why he was able to do it, and what made the town capable of absorbing it without consequence for 23 days. That's the question with a useful answer. He turned to look at her. What you could have done differently on a trail when a man with a rope decided to use it. That question has no useful answer, and it costs you something every time you run it. Rose was quiet. I know, she said. Then, after a moment, I know. I just haven't fully stopped running it. You will, he said. When the outcome resolves into something with a different shape, the question loses its grip. He turned back to the workbench. That's been my experience. She thought about what question he'd been running for 5 years. What shape it had taken in the long altitude winters. Whether it had lost its grip yet, or whether he still ran it in the hours before dawn. She thought she probably knew the answer, and decided not to ask it directly. On the second evening, Samuel left one bough of dried sunflowers on the shelf. She hadn't seen him gather them on the trail, but they were there, propped against the wall on the same shelf as Alice's photograph. And neither of them mentioned it. And in the morning they were still there, and they stayed there for the rest of the weeks in the cabin, the dried petals holding their color in the thin mountain air. The ravens called on the morning of the 4th day, not 1 or 2. The whole colony, erupting from the tree line on the eastern slope with the explosive alarm of birds that had been disturbed at ground level. The sound of it carrying up the ridge and arriving at the cabin before Rose had finished understanding what she was hearing. Samuel was at the window before she processed the significance. The stillness that arrived in him was not calm. She'd learned the difference over 4 days. Calm was the absence of agitation. This was something loaded and contained, the specific focused suspension of a man running rapid calculations. How long, she said. They left the tree line about a mile down the eastern approach. He was reading the angle and the sound and something she couldn't see, moving carefully. Not confident about the terrain, he looked at the light. An hour, perhaps less if they pushed the pace. How many? He looked at her directly. The scatter pattern covered 40 meters of tree line. That's a group moving in spread from 8 to 12 individuals. Organized, not a search party. He turned from the window. Cole moved faster than I expected. He must have had the men already identified before we left, which means he anticipated the possibility that we'd go to ground, which meant Doyle Cole was more afraid than Samuel had calculated, which meant he'd been less strategic and more reactive than his 30-year reputation suggested. And the reason was simple. The telegram to Reed Carver was a threat he couldn't purchase his way past. And the man who had always been able to purchase his way past everything was encountering the specific panic of a mechanism that had never failed him failing. The 3 setups, Rose said. Samuel looked at her. You've been leaving the cabin for an hour each morning, she said. Not foraging, not checking weather. You've been on the approaches. She'd watched him come back each morning with clean hands and no game, and the particular expression of a man reviewing his work. You've been setting preparations since the first day. Since before the first day, he said. I started on the second morning of the climb. Before we reached the cabin, he went to the equipment corner of the cabin, where coils of rope and 3 tools she'd noticed but not named were arranged with the same logic as everything else he organized. I built 3 setups. The eastern approach, the obvious route, the western draw, which looks like an alternative but channels into a dead end I've been improving for 3 years, and the ridge crest, which is the line a good scout would take if they'd assessed the other 2 and were looking for the tactical route. Harland would take the obvious route, Rose said. Yes, but the men he hired might advise differently, depending on their experience. I built for all 3. He picked up the first coil. Bar the door. Don't open it until 3 knocks. 2 quick, 1 slow. If something goes wrong and the knocks don't come, there's a secondary exit in the floor. the fourth board from the north wall. It opens onto a crawl space that runs under the east side and exits into the boulder field. Take the ridge line east to the next spur, follow it until the spruce clears, and there's a secondary trail to the lower canyon. You'll recognize it because I've blazed every third tree with a double cut. Nothing is going to go wrong, Rose said. No, he agreed, but if it did, you'd need to know that. She took the information and stored it the way she stored everything now, completely, without wasted effort, available when needed. How long? 2 hours at most, probably less. He had both coils over one shoulder and the tools. She could see now what they were. The rigging hardware of a man who'd spent years in terrain that required ropes and counterweights, and the mechanical advantage of things set in advance and triggered at the right moment. He was at the door. They're coming because they're afraid. Afraid men are predictable. They move toward the obvious and they make noise, and they make decisions based on what they want to be true, rather than what the terrain is telling them. He looked at her across the cabin. I have been moving through this mountain for 5 years. They have been moving through it for approximately 40 minutes. He went out. Rose barred the door. She moved to the window, not to see. The tree line on the eastern slope was half a mile away, and the approach would be invisible from here. But to listen. The mountain had a vocabulary she'd been learning for 4 days, and she could hear now in the way Samuel had described hearing, not the obvious sounds, but the patterns between them. The ravens had resettled in the upper canopy, intermittent calls rather than the sustained alarm of before. That meant the disturbance on the eastern approach had passed a certain point, had moved out of the range that triggered the sustained colony response. She thought about what Samuel had said about planning one move ahead, about the difference between the kind of terrain reading that let you survive and the kind that let you anticipate. He'd spent 9 years developing the second kind, and then he'd withdrawn it from the world and brought it up here to use only on behalf of his own survival. And that was, she thought about this carefully, not waste exactly. A man was allowed to protect himself, but it was an incomplete use of something that was built for more. The first sound from outside came 35 minutes into the wait, a sharp mechanical crack, the sound of a loaded mechanism releasing, followed by sustained motion in the upper canopy of the eastern tree line. Something moving through the branches at speed, not falling but being moved, lifted, the particular quality of a counterweight doing its work. Then silence. The second sound came 12 minutes later, from the direction of the western draw. Muffled, lower in register, the sound of dislodged rock and something more substantial impacting, contained earth. Then voices, distant and sharp, the voices of men discovering that the ground they'd been told to walk on wasn't what it appeared to be. Then, nothing for 19 minutes, nothing was its own information. She tracked it the way she'd tracked everything for 23 days. Not passively but actively, reading what the absence meant. No gunshots, no sustained shouting, no sound of men moving in organized pursuit. The specific silence of a mountain that had absorbed something and settled back into itself. Then Samuel walked out of the tree line. Not running, walking. The walk of a man returning from completed work unhurried. The rifle on his shoulder at carry rather than ready, the rope coils gone from his shoulder. She had the bar off the door before his third step on the approach path. He came inside, set the tools and the remaining hardware against the wall, and stood in the middle of the cabin with the expression of a man doing post-action accounting. 7 men in positions on this mountain that require external assistance to exit, he said. None of them are injured in any way that requires medical attention. Several of them are going to have a very specific and useful education about the difference between the terrain they imagined and the terrain they were actually walking through. He went to the water barrel and drank. Harland Coal is approximately 40 yards below the ridge crest, attached to a ponderosa pine with a length of rope that requires a specific sequence of releases to open. He rode up with the group but separated at the western draw when his hired men hit the first setup. He panicked and went for the ridgeline, which is exactly what I expected. Rose looked at him. Alive, cold, not injured. He set the cup down. The 8th man rode back down the access trail when the first sound came from the eastern approach. That's the one I wanted to run, she understood. The man who ran was the message. The message that Doyle Cole's money had sent 8 men up a mountain, and none of them had accomplished what they'd been paid to accomplish. that the man living on this mountain was not a problem that could be solved by the mechanisms Doyle Cole was accustomed to deploying. The message, arriving at Doyle Cole's door tonight, was, "The thing you sent men to stop has already stopped you. How long before they can get him down?" she said. "The men in the pit traps can get themselves out in a day if they work together and don't make it worse. The man in the snare will need someone to come up with the specific knowledge of the counterweight release." He paused. "Harland will be on that tree until I cut him loose or Carver sends deputies up here to retrieve him." "You're not cutting him loose?" "No," Samuel said. "A man who's been cold and hungry and attached to a pine tree for 2 weeks tends to arrive at cooperation in ways that a comfortable man doesn't. When Carver gets here, I want Harland Cole in the state of mind that makes full cooperation feel like the best available option." Rose thought about this, not about the ethics of it. She'd moved past the stage where she had ethics available to spend on Harland Cole's comfort. She thought about the practical downstream shape. Harland's 2 weeks of cold reconsideration, the cooperation that followed, the additional specificity that cooperation would add to the federal case. "Carver will want a statement from him," she said. "Carver will get a complete statement from him," Samuel said. "Which is why Harland is staying on the tree." She looked at Samuel across the cabin. In the late afternoon light that came through the single west-facing window, his face had the particular quality of someone who has done a difficult thing and is at rest with having done it. Not proud, not relieved, but settled. The way a correctly solved problem settles. "You're not the same person you were 5 years ago," she said. He looked at her. "How do you mean? 5 years ago you came up here because you couldn't be in the world without what had happened happening again? That's a person managing loss by reducing exposure." She looked at him steadily. "The man who walked into my post office and asked how many days I'd been standing. That's not the same calculation. That's a different person. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Alice would say the mountain taught me that some things you can plan for, and some things you can only be present for," he said. She would say, "I spent 9 years learning the first kind and the mountain gave me 5 years to figure out that the second kind is harder and more important." He paused. "I'm still figuring it out." "You're further along than you think," Rose said. The fire in the stove was doing its evening work. Outside, the mountain was doing what mountains do in the hour before dark, settling, the sounds changing register as the temperature dropped and the birds moved to their roost positions. Somewhere on the ridge above them, Harland Cole was beginning the first evening of a very instructive 2 weeks. Below, Redstone Crossing was whatever it was without them, and 2 days south of Redstone Crossing. In Denver, Reed Carver was making his arrangements. 10 days passed. 10 days in which the mountain did what mountains do to people who are given the conditions to let it. Not comfort exactly, but the specific correction that comes from being in a place that operates by different rules than the ones that had been grinding her down. The air, the altitude, the quality of silence that wasn't absence but presence, the presence of something vast and indifferent that had been here before anyone who wanted anything from her and would be here after. Her body did its accounting in earnest. The fever withdrew completely on day 6, the last trace of it gone overnight, and she woke on day 7 with a clarity in her head that she hadn't had since July. The particular sharpness of a mind that had been running through haze for weeks suddenly operating in clean air. The wounds on her hip and lower back moved through their stages with the efficiency of properly treated tissue. The deep cleaning and the Usnea poultice had done what they were designed to do, and Samuel's daily binding changes tracked the progress with the same methodical attention he brought to everything. On day 8, she walked to the western side of the cabin without managing every step. On day 9, she walked to the viewpoint, the granite shelf that jutted from the west face of the ridge and looked straight down into the valley, a view that dropped 2,000 feet in a single unobstructed line to the floor of the Redstone Crossing basin. She stood there for a long time. From here the town was a cluster of shapes. The stamp mill stack, the grid of the main street, the church roof. The post office was too small to identify specifically, but she knew its position relative to the other buildings, and she looked at that position and felt something that she worked at understanding, not longing, not dread. Something more structural, the specific quality of a person looking at a place they've left and recognizing that the leaving and the returning are both necessary parts of the same action. You had to leave to get the elevation. You had to have the elevation to see the shape of what you were returning to. Samuel came and stood beside her. He'd been giving her the viewpoint alone each time she came to it, coming after enough time had passed that the alone was complete. "I'm going back," she said. "I know, when Carver comes. Not before, because going back before means fighting the same fight every day without the federal presence to change the ground conditions. But when Carver comes, yes," he said. She looked at the town, the people who looked away. "Some of them will be there every time I come in for their mail. Yes, I'm going to have to figure out what to do with that." "You will," he said. "Not reassurance, confirmation. The same quality as everything else," he stated. "You've already started doing it. Wait, you spoke to Martha Bowen in the alley. The way you gave Jesse Harding the forms and explained what to do with them. You're already figuring out the difference between people who looked away because they're constitutionally incapable of better, and the people who looked away because they were afraid, and haven't yet decided what to do with the shame of that." Rose thought about Edna Broff in the alley with her eyes on the ground. About the 3 people sitting in the post office waiting room on the day Harland Cole had tapped the counter and told her the deadline had moved. 3 people who'd heard everything and chosen to examine their hands. About Doc Taft with his pen, writing 11 minutes worth of truth because a man had sat across from him and named the thing he'd done and offered him a path that was narrower and harder and less comfortable than the one he'd been walking but led somewhere that the other path didn't. "Martha's bread," she said. "Did Carver's deputy actually mention it?" He mentioned it with the expression of a man who'd received several deliveries of unexplained baked goods and was uncertain about the protocol. Samuel said. Rose looked at the town below. She didn't stop when they came down from the mountain. She kept sending it, a pause. She knew we were up here. Most of the town probably knew, or could figure it. Redstone Crossing isn't large. He paused. The question is what people do with what they know. She sent bread, Rose said. It's not enough. But it's not nothing, no, Samuel said. It's not nothing. The sun was moving toward the western peaks, and the light on the granite below them was changing color. The same progression she'd watched each evening from the cabin door. The pale gold of mid-afternoon deepening toward the amber orange of approach to dusk, the shadows in the ravines going from blue to deep purple. The town below them was indifferent to the light, its shape staying constant while the color around them shifted. She thought about the dime she'd found in the bottom of the supply cabinet when she'd retrieved the deed, the one her father had left there with the deliberate absent-mindedness of a man creating a small discovery for whoever came after him. He'd done things like that. Small unannounced gifts waiting in the infrastructure of the post office, for her specifically, for whoever came after. A way of being present in a space after you were gone. She thought about what she'd leave behind in the infrastructure of the post office when she was gone. What the next postmistress would find in the false bottom, or under the shelf, or in the particular placement of things her father had taught her to arrange. He used to say, she said, and then stopped and started differently. My father used to say that the post office was a public trust, not a private business. That the designation meant something. That the federal government had decided this function was important enough to protect, and accepting the designation meant accepting the responsibility to be worth protecting. She paused. I used to think that was a slightly grandiose way to think about sorting mail, and now, Samuel said, now I think it wasn't grandiose enough, she said. He was describing something about what public institutions are for, what it means to be the place where people can send and receive the truth of their lives, and to do that without fear or favor. He was describing something I had to lose, and nearly lose my life over before I understood the full weight of it. She turned from the viewpoint and walked back toward the cabin. What happens when Doyle Cole's lawyers arrive, she said. They'll arrive after Carver has secured the primary evidence and taken initial statements. At that point, the lawyers are managing the terms of a negotiation, not preventing an outcome. He walked beside her. Cole's best available move is cooperation that produces a reduced sentence. He's 60. He knows what 20 years in a territorial penitentiary looks like for a man his age. His lawyers will tell him cooperation is the arithmetic that makes the most sense. And Harland's position is documented premeditation. The calendar page plus the lariat fragment, plus the physical evidence of the assault, constitutes a case that a defense attorney can complicate but not dissolve. He paused. He'll serve time. Rose nodded. She thought about all of this, not with satisfaction, which was too clean an emotion for the shape of what had happened, but with the specific awareness of a person who had been inside a closed system and was watching it open. The system had been designed to contain her, to make the cost of speaking higher than the cost of silence, to make her invisible to any authority that might act on her behalf. The telegram had made a hole in the containment. The evidence had made the hole larger, and Reed Carver, riding south from Denver in his gray duster, was the thing that was going to walk through the hole and change the system's ground conditions permanently. It wasn't justice, exactly. She'd lived 22 years and she knew that justice as an absolute was a legal fiction and a useful one, and not the same as what actually happened in the world. What was happening was something more specific and more achievable: consequence. Harland Cole was going to experience consequence. Doyle Cole was going to experience consequence. Doc Taft had already begun experiencing consequence. The people of Redstone Crossing were going to have to experience the consequence of having looked away, which was the specific discomfort of being required to look directly. That wasn't everything, but it was substantial. It was something that would still be there in 10 years, in the record, in the shape of what the town had done and what had been done about it. She thought about Jesse Harding growing up in that town with that record. She thought about what shape he'd be grown into by the time he was 40. On the 12th day, riding the morning weather check that had become his daily habit, Samuel came back to the cabin moving with a different quality of purpose, and Rose looked at his face and knew before he spoke. "Rider on the access road," he said. "Gray duster, federal badge." Alone was the crucial detail. Carver had come to assess before he brought his deputies into the situation, which was either caution or intelligence, and was probably both. The approach of a man who didn't walk into other people's operational situations without first understanding what those situations actually were. "How long?" Rose said. "An hour to the cabin. Less if he knows the approaches." He paused. "He'll know some of them." "Not all. We should go down to meet him," Rose said. "Make him climb the full grade and he arrives at the cabin at altitude and short of breath, which is no way to begin a working relationship." Samuel looked at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "That's correct. Let's go." They rode down to meet Carver on the lower ridge, the horse picking its way down the switchbacks with the ease of an animal that knew this trail, the air warming as they descended toward the 7,000-foot line. They found him an hour later on the broad shelf where the trail leveled briefly before the last steep section. A lean man of 50 in a gray duster that had been on many roads, with the particular eyes of someone who dealt in the management of truth for a living. Not hard eyes, calibrated, set to a frequency that false things registered against. He dismounted and looked at Samuel first, then Rose, then back at Samuel. "Briggs," he said. "Carver, you look like you've been sleeping outside." "I've been sleeping outside for 20 years, Samuel said. 2 extra weeks doesn't revise the math. Carver looked at Rose. The assessment look, thorough, not unkind. The look of a man who needed accurate information from what he was seeing, Miss Callaway. "You sent the telegram." "I sent the telegram," she said. "You have the fragment, the medical documentation, the written evidence, all of it." She reached into her interior coat pocket and produced the flat envelope she'd been carrying since they'd left the post office. Held it out. "The property deed with the federal designation stamp is in there as well." Carver took the envelope, opened it with the careful speed of a man who handled legal materials regularly and knew their weight. Read through each document. The lariat fragment held up to the morning light, the calendar page examined longer than the other items. Taft's signed-in statement read through twice. He was quiet throughout, and his quiet had the quality of a man building something from the information rather than reacting to it. "Cole family," he said. "Not a question. Mayor Doyle Cole and his son Harland," Rose said. "Doc Warren Taft provided the medical statement under conditions I can describe fully if needed." "I'll need all of it," Carver said. "Every decision, every sequence, every person involved." He folded the documents back into the envelope. "There's a man on a tree somewhere on this mountain, if my briefing was accurate. East Ridge," Samuel said. 40 yards below the crest. "He's been there 11 days, Carver looked up the slope. "Cooperative?" "He was hypothermic for the first 2 days. He's had time to reconsider his options since then. A pause. 11 days on a pine tree at 8,000 feet produces a particular kind of clarity about one's available futures. Carver looked at Samuel for a moment with an expression that was the closest thing to humor his face appeared to produce. Then he looked at Rose. I have 6 deputies staged at the canyon base. I'll bring them up this afternoon. We'll deal with the man on the tree, and then we're going to Redstone Crossing for a very specific kind of morning. What kind of morning? Rose said. Carver put the envelope into his interior coat pocket and looked down the ridge toward the valley. The kind where the people who've been running a particular system for 30 years find out that the system has stopped running, he said. The kind Rose had been working toward since the morning of the 23rd day. When a man she didn't know had walked into her post office and asked how many days she'd been standing, and she'd told him the truth because something in the way he asked had made the truth feel like information rather than exposure. She looked at Samuel. He was looking at the valley below, the same view they'd been looking at from the cabin for 12 days. The same collection of shapes that was Redstone Crossing doing its indifferent business 2,000 feet below. He looked back at her. Ready, she said. He nodded once. The nod of a man who had planned for this and watched it arrive at the shape he'd planned for, and found the arrival sufficient. They rode down together in the clear mountain morning, the 3 of them, toward the town that owed Rose Callaway a debt it was about to begin paying. Reed Carver rode into Redstone Crossing on a Tuesday morning at 7:45, which was 15 minutes before the town hall opened for its weekly council session, and 45 minutes before most of the town had finished its breakfast. He did not announce himself. This was deliberate, the standard protocol when local authority was the subject of investigation rather than its instrument. You didn't send a telegram ahead. You didn't ride in with ceremony. You arrived at the velocity of the wire that had preceded you by 2 weeks, and you moved through the town's morning routine before the town had time to arrange itself into the presentation it would have prepared if it had known you were coming. Rose rode beside him. Samuel rode on his left. She'd been watching the town approach for the last hour of the descent, the shapes below resolving from the abstract cluster she'd been looking at from the ridge into the specific familiar geography of the place she'd lived her entire life. The stamp mill's stack, the church on the north end, the Main Street grid with its boardwalks and its hitching posts, and its particular morning traffic of a Colorado mining town conducting its commerce. The post office, third building from the east end of Main Street. With the closure notice still visible in the front window and the repaired shutter she'd fixed that morning before they'd left it for the mountain 12 days ago. It looked the same. It was not the same. She was not the same person looking at it, and that asymmetry, the town unchanged and her relationship to it entirely revised, was something she understood intellectually, but was still processing emotionally as they rode in on the North Road and the first heads turned on the boardwalk. Carver's grey duster did its work. People recognized the cut of it before they read the badge, and the recognition moved through the morning street in a visible wave, heads turning, conversation stopping, the specific recalibration of a public space that has just become aware of a federal presence. Carver rode to the town hall and tied his horse without looking at the people watching from the boardwalk. His 6 deputies fell in behind him with the practiced economy of men who'd done this before in enough towns that the ceremony of it had worn smooth. Rose and Samuel stayed mounted. Carver had been clear about the sequence. He went in first. The deputy secured the exits, then Rose. When he called for her, she waited outside the town hall on horseback and listened to the mountain morning doing what it always did indifferently. The stamp mill, the street traffic, the particular acoustic signature of 800 people going about their lives. A woman came out of the dry goods store across the street and stopped on the boardwalk and looked at Rose with an expression that was several things at once. None of them simple. Rose looked back at her without moving. Samuel was beside her, one hand on the reins, not speaking. His presence had the quality it had been developing over the past 2 weeks, not protective, not managing, but parallel. A person occupying the same situation by choice rather than obligation. The town hall door opened. One of Carver's deputies leaned out and nodded. Rose dismounted. She went inside. The council chamber was a room she'd been in 3 times in her life. Once as a child with her father, when he'd argued the postal designation before the council. Once at 18 when she'd formally assumed the postmistress position after his death, and once last spring when she'd tried to report what had happened at Miller's Creek through official channels and had been told by the council clerk that no such report appeared in the records. The room was full. Doyle Cole sat at the head of the long table in the chair that had been his for 30 years, the largest chair, centered on the long wall, positioned to put every other person in the room at a slight downward angle relative to him. He was 60 and looked like a man who had spent 60 years accumulating the specific solidity of someone who has never seriously had to doubt his own position. 12 council members occupied the other chairs. The weekly session had clearly been in progress. Papers on the table, the clerk's notes visible at the far end, the particular arrangement of men mid-transaction. Carver stood at the foot of the table. He had not sat down. He would not sit down in this room, which was a choice that communicated its own information about the nature of his presence here. He had a document in his hand. He waited for Rose to take a position beside him before he read it. Doyle Cole, he said, at the register of a man making a formal record rather than having a conversation. Harland Cole. By the authority of the United States Marshal's Office for the Colorado Territory. Pursuant to criminal statutes governing assault, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and fraudulent interference with federal postal operations, I am executing warrants for your arrest on the charges detailed in the attached federal complaint. He set the warrant on the table in front of Doyle Cole without moving from where he stood. The complaint is supported by physical evidence, a signed medical affidavit, documentary evidence of premeditation, and witness testimony. You are entitled to legal representation, which I suggest you arrange immediately. The council chamber was absolutely silent. Doyle Cole looked at the warrant. He looked at it for a long time, not reading it, she thought, because he'd known something like this was possible from the moment the telegram cleared the circuit, had known it was probable from the moment Harlan's hired men came back from the mountain one short. He was looking at it the way a man looks at the moment when the architecture he's been building for 30 years becomes the evidence against him. Then he looked at Rose. She looked back at him steadily, not with triumph. She'd thought about what she'd feel in this moment, and she'd expected something larger, some cathartic resolution, and what she actually felt was quieter and more specific. She felt the particular clarity of someone who has done what they came to do and is now watching the consequence arrive at the address it was sent to. One of Carver's deputies moved to stand beside Doyle Cole's chair. Another moved toward the door. The third was already outside. Doyle Cole stood up from his chair with the deliberate dignity of a man who decided that his one remaining available act was to stand up without being made to stand up. He looked at the warrant, then at Carver, then once more at Rose. He did not speak. He walked toward the deputy at the door with his hands at his sides. And the council members at the table sat in the particular silence of men understanding simultaneously that the ground under them had changed and that they were going to have to decide, each of them individually, how to navigate what came next. The morning that Reed Carver had promised was exactly what he'd said it would be. Outside, the town was watching, not the arranged, self-conscious watching of people who'd been told something was happening. The organic watching of a community that had been conducting its mourning and had suddenly had the mourning interrupted by an event that reorganized everything around it. People on the boardwalks, in the doorways of shops, a cluster forming at the corner of Main Street and the alley that ran behind the hardware store, all oriented toward the town hall and the horses outside it, and the gray-dusted federal deputies moving with quiet purpose. Doyle Cole came out of the town hall between two deputies and the street went quieter. Rose came out behind Carver and stood on the boardwalk step and looked at the town that had looked away from her for 23 days. The cluster of people at the corner. The woman who'd been outside the dry goods store and was still there, still watching. The man outside the feed merchants who'd turned completely around from whatever errand had brought him out. The two women at the north end of the boardwalk who had stopped walking and were standing very still. Samuel came to stand beside Rose on the step. Deputy Lyle Marsh was in the crowd. She saw him when his face processed what was happening. Doyle Cole being walked to the federal horses, the deputies moving with the efficiency of men completing a practiced procedure. Marsh's expression went through several things rapidly. disbelief, calculation, and then something that was possibly the beginning of understanding that the architecture he'd been operating inside had just been condemned. Carver's men would deal with Marsh separately. That process was already moving. She'd spoken with Carver the previous afternoon about Marsh's specific role, and Carver had listened to the full account with the same methodical attention he brought to everything, and said that Deputy Lyle Marsh would be having a productive conversation with a federal prosecutor before the end of the week. She looked at the faces on the boardwalk and tried to read what was there. She'd lived in this town her entire life, and she knew these faces as well as she knew the cubbies in the post office, their histories, their relationships, the particular pressures they operated under. The woman outside the dry goods store was Clara Whitfield, whose husband worked in the Cole family's mine and whose mortgage on their house was held by Cole's land company. The man outside the feed merchants was George Aldrich, who'd been the dry goods clerk for 15 years before his wife had put together enough for them to buy out the previous owner with a loan from. She didn't need to finish the thought. The two women at the north end of the boardwalk were the Fairweather sisters, who ran the boarding house, and the boarding house's primary commercial accounts were the miners who came through on coal company contracts. Every one of them had been inside a system that made looking away the economically rational choice. Every one of them had made that choice. Every one of them was standing here now, watching the system change and trying to calculate out what the change meant for the specific way the system had been constraining them. She wasn't going to tell them how to feel about what they'd done. That wasn't her function and it wasn't her right. What she was going to do was continue to exist in this town, in this post office, doing the work that she'd inherited and chose to do. And the people who came through that door to collect their mail were going to have to decide for themselves how to stand in the same room as the woman they'd looked past for 23 days. That was all. That was enough. Requiring more from them was beyond her jurisdiction, and she'd spent enough of herself on things beyond her jurisdiction. She was looking for Martha Bowen in the crowd, and not finding her when Carver came out behind her. "The church," he said. "This afternoon, I need statements from everyone involved in the sequence of events. You, Briggs, Harding, and anyone else with direct knowledge." He looked at the crowd on the street. "I'll send word through the council. The community members who have relevant information will be given the opportunity to provide it voluntarily before I determine whether formal subpoenas are necessary." "They'll come," Rose said. Carver looked at her. "Voluntary versus subpoena," she said. "In a town this size, the decision to volunteer is also a public declaration. The people who have something to say and want to say it will use the opportunity. The ones who don't will calculate whether staying absent looks worse than showing up." She paused. "In my experience of this town, they'll mostly show up. Whether out of guilt or self-interest or genuine reckoning, they'll mostly show up." Carver looked at her for a moment with the slight recalibration that had become familiar. The update of an assessment, the accommodation of information that was more complete than expected. 2 o'clock, he said. "Church?" He walked to his horse and rode toward the jail at the south end of town, where Doyle Cole was being held pending the formal proceeding. The crowd on the boardwalk redistributed, the specific motion of people who have been watching something that has now moved and are deciding whether to follow it or return to the ordinary day. Samuel looked at Rose. "The post office? The post office?" she said. They walked down Main Street together, and she unlocked the front door of the post office and took down the closure notice and opened for business. The post office smelled of paper and dust and the particular mineral note of the telegraph key's brass fittings that she'd been smelling since childhood. The cubbies held 2 weeks of accumulated correspondence, sorted by Carver's deputy who'd secured the building in the days after their departure. The telegraph key sat in its cradle. She stood at the counter and put her hands on the oak surface and felt the grain under her palms. Diagonal, left to right, the knot near the center stained to match, her father's 40 years of work underneath every inch of it. She stood there for approximately 30 seconds. Then she sat down on the stool. The movement produced the managed pull of healing tissue that she had practiced navigating, and then it resolved into the simple fact of sitting at the counter of her father's post office on a Tuesday morning in September, and the ordinary miracle of that. After 23 days, after Miller's Creek, after the mountain and the telegram, and the fragment of oxblood lariat, and all of it, was something she registered through her whole body at once. She picked up the routing slips from the pending tray and began working through them. The bell above the door chimed at 20 minutes past 8. Martha Bowen came in without her basket. Without the particular authority of a woman certain of her welcome. She came in the way a person comes into a room when they're not sure they've earned the right to be in it, which was an expression Rose had never seen on Martha Bowen in 50 years of being Martha Bowen. And the novelty of it was its own information. She came to the counter. She stood on the customer's side of the white oak. I knew, she said. Not, I didn't know what to do. Not, I was afraid of what would happen to Bernard's business. Not the versions Rose had been mentally composing responses to for 2 weeks on the mountain. Just, I knew the plain version. The one that required her to be the agent of her own knowledge, rather than the passive recipient of circumstances beyond her control. I knew from the first morning, Martha said, before you told me anything. I saw you come in, and I saw how you were standing, and I knew it wasn't a riding accident, because I'd seen you ride since you were 12 years old, and I knew what a riding accident would look like on you, and this wasn't that. She stopped. Her hands were folded in front of her on the counter surface, the gesture of a woman accounting for something. I chose what was easier. I know the word for that. I've been using a different word for it for 3 weeks, and the word I've been using is wrong. Rose looked at her. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Martha said. I know that's not something you're required to do. I'm saying the true thing because I've been saying a false thing for 3 weeks, and every morning when I unlocked the bakery door I could taste it, and I'm done tasting it. The post office was quiet. Somewhere outside, the stamp mill was running its morning rhythm, indifferent as always. You have 2 weeks of mail held for pickup, Rose said, and a parcel from Philadelphia that arrived on the 14th. Martha looked at her. Something in the evenness of it, the neither forgiveness nor refusal of it, the simple continuation of the function, the offer of the ordinary transaction as the space where they would both have to figure out how to be. Something in that produced in Martha Bowen's face the expression of a woman understanding that what she'd done wasn't going to be made neat and resolved and put away, and that this was the correct outcome. She took her mail. She took the parcel. At the door she stopped. The bread, she said. Carver's deputy said, I know, Rose said, I didn't stop when you left because Martha stopped, started again. Because it was the only thing I knew how to do that was actually in the direction of right, even if it was the smallest possible version of right. The smallest possible version of right, Rose said carefully, is still in the direction of right. She said it without warmth, without absolution, without the performing of a forgiveness she hadn't decided whether to give. She said it as a factual observation about the mathematics of moral action, which was what she meant, and which Martha Bowen could do with what she chose. Martha went out. The bell chimed. The dust resettled. Rose returned to the routing slips. At 9:15, Jesse Harding came through the door. He wasn't there for mail. 14-year-olds in livery work rarely had correspondence. He came in with the posture of someone delivering a report he'd been composing since he'd watched the federal deputies ride down Main Street an hour ago. I saw them take Mr. Cole, he said, standing at the counter. The report delivery posture, straight and careful, I know, Rose said. Were you all right? He considered this seriously, which she appreciated. I think so. I kept thinking about what you said, about what my testimony was worth when it was the moment that mattered. A pause. It was the moment, wasn't it? It was one of the moments, Rose said. There were several. Yours was essential. She reached under the counter and produced the claim forms she'd set aside for him 2 weeks ago. These are for your father. The boarding fees the Cole family owes the livery. File them with the federal proceeding. Carver's deputy can tell you the process. The Cole estate will be liquidated as part of the criminal proceedings and the legitimate debts will be honored. Jesse took the forms. He looked at them with the expression of someone holding something that represented a version of his future that he hadn't been sure would be available. Marshal Carver said I should consider the law, he said. When I'm older, he's right, Rose said. The federal kind specifically. It needs people who can observe accurately without letting the observation become the conclusion. You have that quality, she looked at him. It's rarer than you'd think. He left with the forms held carefully in both hands, and Rose watched him go and thought about what he'd become at 30, at 40. With this morning in his formation, this specific September morning, when he'd watched the man who'd told him something wasn't his business get walked out of the town hall between federal deputies, and he'd come directly to the post office to report. That was the thing her father had meant by connective tissue. The post office was where people came when something mattered. When something mattered enough to send. When something mattered enough to receive. And sometimes when something mattered enough to simply be in the presence of the function, to stand at the counter and make the small transaction that was also a larger one. She worked through the routing slips. She operated the telegraph key when the morning traffic came in. 2 messages from Denver, 1 from Santa Fe. The usual commercial correspondence that didn't stop because the postmistress had been on a mountain. She sorted the accumulated 2 weeks of mail into the cubbies with the systematic efficiency of someone returning to a function they knew in their hands. At 11:30, Samuel came in through the front door. He put a bundle of outgoing correspondence on the counter. Denver, he said. Same commercial address. She looked at the bundle. She looked at him. You said twice a year, she said. For trade, he said. I'm revising the schedule for everything else. He said it the way he said the certain things. Not offered for negotiation, not performed for effect, stated as a condition that had been assessed and determined. The Garfields rent a room above the hardware store. They do. Mrs. Garfield's coffee has been described as medicinal. I've had worse. He rested his forearms on the counter in the way he'd rested them on the counter of this same building. On the morning he'd first walked in and she'd watched him orient to the space before he addressed its occupant, and the familiarity of it. The gesture and this counter and this room moved through her with the specific quality of something that had been present a short time but had already become part of the architecture. There are practical considerations, she said, beginning to prepare his routing slips. There are always practical considerations, he said. I've been navigating practical considerations since I was 22. I'm reasonably experienced. You've been navigating them alone. Which is the consideration I'm revising, he said. He looked at her across the counter with the directness that had been his default since the first morning. The revision is not contingent on resolution of the practical considerations. The revision is the prior decision. She finished the routing slip, held it out. Their hands were an inch apart across the oak surface. 2 o'clock at the church, she said. Carver needs our statements, I know. He took the slip. I'll be there. He went out. The bell chimed. She sat at the counter in the morning light of her father's post office and put her hands on the oak grain and felt the full weight of the day. What it had contained, what it had accomplished, what it had opened. And she allowed herself briefly to feel the thing that was not triumph and not relief but something more durable than either. Then she returned to work, because the work was what the day required, and the work was what she was here for, and those 2 facts had never been more completely aligned. The church was full at 2 o'clock. Carver had sent word through the council at noon, framing the session as a voluntary opportunity to provide relevant information. He'd been precise about the framing, voluntary, relevant, opportunity, and Rose had been right about what those words would produce. The people of Redstone Crossing came because the word voluntary, in a town where the federal government had spent the morning arresting the man who'd been the primary economic force for 3 decades, carried an implicit second meaning that everyone understood. Come now, voluntarily, or be called later. They filled the pews from the front, which was not how Redstone Crossing normally arranged itself in this building. Normally, the hierarchy of the town organized the seating. The family of the mine superintendent at the front, the working families toward the back, the gradient of position and economic relationship to the coal enterprise visible in who sat where. Today, people sat where they could find space, and the randomness of it produced a different kind of room. Rose sat at the front table that Carver had set up, facing the pews. Samuel sat beside her. Jessie Harding sat on her other side. Doc Taft's seat was empty. He'd left Redstone Crossing 6 days before Carver's arrival, which Carver had already been informed of, and which constituted its own form of testimony. Carver stood at the front of the room and explained the purpose of the session in the plain and unhurried language of a man who'd done this before, in enough places to have learned that people absorbed information better when it wasn't performed at them. He was taking statements. He was building a federal record. Anyone with direct knowledge of the events of July 23rd and the subsequent 23 days was invited to speak. Nothing said here would be used against any speaker unless that speaker was a named defendant in the federal complaint. He looked at the room. Miss Callaway will speak first, he said. Rose stood. She had not prepared remarks. She'd considered preparing them and decided against it. Anything prepared would be the version of events she'd been composing in her head for weeks, the shaped and managed account, and what Carver needed and what this room needed was the unmanaged one. The one she'd told Samuel in the back room of the post office on the morning of the 23rd day, leaning against the mail sacks with the weight finally off her legs. She told it. She told it in the plain sequential order of a postmistress describing a series of events, because that was what she was, and that was how her mind organized information. She told it without editorial and without the performance of the emotion that was present and real, but didn't require display to be true. She described the creek trail on the Thursday afternoon, and the particular sound of the lariat going taut. She described the shale and the distance and the 2-mile return. She described Doc Taft's examination room and the man in the doorway and the sound of the satchel being picked up. She described 23 days of standing in the post office and the customers who came and went and the specific quality of their collective decision not to see. The church was absolutely quiet, not the quiet of people deciding how to feel. The quiet of people who were already feeling it and had no management available. She described the morning Samuel had walked in and asked his technical question without theater, and what happened after, and the telegram to Carver and the mountain. She described Harland Cole's hired men and the 2 weeks on the ridge and coming back down. When she finished, she sat down. Samuel stood next. He described the physical evidence, the lariat fragment, its specific characteristics, its provenance, what its presence inside Rose's wound documented about Doc Taft's deliberate omission. He described Taft's statement and the conditions under which it had been produced. He described the calendar page and what Harland Cole's handwriting on it established about privation. Then he did something that hadn't been part of the plan. My wife Alice Briggs died in 1876, he said, in Burden Creek, Wyoming. She was 29 years old. She was injured by men acting in the interests of a powerful man who wanted something she had. She went to 4 people in her community. All 4 of them chose the powerful man. He stopped for a moment, not for effect, but because the thing he was saying required the pause it required. She died from wounds that weren't treated because no one with the capacity to treat them chose to do so. I was not there. I was doing my job 6 weeks away, and I had trusted that the community around her would protect her in my absence. The church did not move. I'm telling you this because what happened to Miss Callaway is not an isolated event. It is a category of event. It happens when a community decides collectively that the cost of looking is higher than the cost of not looking. When that decision is made, the person who is not looked at bears the entire cost of the community's comfort. In Burden Creek, it cost my wife her life. In Redstone Crossing, it nearly cost Miss Callaway hers. He looked at the room. I don't know what each of you told yourselves about why you didn't ask the question that needed asking. I know what the people in Burden Creek told themselves. They told themselves it wasn't their business. They told themselves they didn't have the full picture. They told themselves someone else would handle it. He paused. Someone else didn't handle it. I'm asking you to think about that. He sat down. The silence that followed was the silence of a room sitting with something it had been handed that it couldn't put down immediately. Jess Harding spoke next. He stood with the posture of someone who'd decided on something and was executing the decision without renegotiating it mid-execution. He said 4 sentences. He was here on the road. He saw Miss Callaway. He heard what Harland Cole said. He found the calendar page in the stable, and he'd kept it because it seemed like something that shouldn't be thrown away. 4 sentences. Sufficient. After Jesse, Carver opened the floor. What followed was not the dramatic wave of confession that the situation's emotional pressure might have produced in a different kind of room. What happened was quieter and more specific. 1 man at a time, 2 women, then another man, each standing briefly and saying what they'd seen or heard or known, in the plain language of people who were accounting rather than performing. Clara Whitfield described the morning she'd watched Rose come to the post office on what must have been day 4 or 5 and had turned to walk the other way. She said it without decoration. George Aldrich said he'd heard the true account from his wife the week after it happened and had made a deliberate decision not to engage with it. He said the word deliberate specifically, and the specificity of it was its own kind of reckoning. Not everyone spoke. Several people sat in silence through the full session, and their silence was its own statement, and Carver noted it and moved on. Martha Bowen spoke near the end. She stood up and said, "I knew from the first morning. I chose to call it a riding accident, and I told Rose Callaway to push through the stiffness, and I've been calling that choice by a wrong name for 3 weeks." She sat down, nothing else. No explanation, no contextualizing, just the account, placed in the record. Carver closed the session at 4:30. He thanked the room for the voluntary statements and explained the next steps in the federal proceeding in his precise and unhurried way. The room emptied with the specific quality of people who had done something that cost them something and were now carrying the cost out into the street with them. Rose sat at the front table after the room had cleared and looked at the empty pews for a few minutes. Samuel sat beside her without speaking. The late afternoon light was coming through the church's western window at the angle that turned everything briefly gold before it faded, and the empty pews in that light had the quality of a space that had been used for exactly what it was built for. "Doc Taft," she said. "What about him? He left before Carver got here. He's not going to face a formal proceeding." "No," Samuel said. "He lost his license. He's going to spend the rest of his career being the doctor who falsified a report, and the board is going to follow him wherever he goes." A pause. "Some consequences are administrative rather than criminal. He sent a letter," Rose said, "before he left. It was in the accumulated mail at the post office this morning. Addressed to me. She'd found it in the cubbies when she was sorting the 2 weeks of held correspondence. Her name on the envelope in Taft's handwriting, the particular handwriting of a man who'd had good penmanship and had let it deteriorate. Did you read it?" "Not yet." She looked at the empty pews. "I'll read it when I'm ready to read it. I don't know when that is." A pause. "I think the fact that he wrote it matters. I think what he says in it will determine whether it matters more than that or less." Samuel nodded. Outside, Redstone Crossing was moving into its evening, the stamp mill beginning to wind down for the shift change. The particular quality of sound that the town made in the hour before supper, when the day's commerce was closing and the domestic life was opening. She'd heard that sound her entire life from inside the post office, from inside the building her father had built and filled with the function of connection, of information moving honestly between people who needed to send and receive the true things of their lives. She was going to keep hearing it. The weeks after Carver's session moved in the specific rhythm of aftermath. Not resolution exactly, because resolution implied a completion that the actual texture of events didn't support, but the beginning of the long process by which things that have been broken are assessed for what can be salvaged and what must be rebuilt. Harland Cole's formal indictment came down from the territorial court in Denver 12 days after Carver's arrival. The charges were assault with premeditation, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and interference with federal postal operations. His cooperation, which Carver had characterized to Rose as comprehensive if not enthusiastic, produced a specific accounting of every mechanism the Cole family had used to maintain its position in Redstone Crossing, the mortgage instruments, the economic leverage over businesses and livelihoods, the systematic cultivation of Marsh and Taft, and the various council members who'd made themselves available to be cultivated. The accounting was detailed enough to be useful and thorough enough to constitute its own kind of sentence, regardless of the formal one that followed. 20 years in the territorial penitentiary. The Cole family landholdings, which had been the instrument of the leverage, were liquidated through federal proceedings and the proceeds distributed to the legitimate debts they'd been used to create, including the Harding livery, which received its boarding fees in full with interest, and which Bernard Bowen's bakery mortgage was discharged from entirely, which was a consequence Rose had not anticipated, and which produced in her a complicated response that she sat with for several days before deciding it didn't change her assessment of what Martha had done. It changed her assessment of what Martha was trying to do, which was not the same thing and was worth distinguishing. Doyle Cole accepted a plea arrangement. He was 60, and his lawyers were good, and they were correct that 20 years was not survivable for a man of his age with his habits. and cooperation produced a modified sentence of 8 years and immediate resignation from all public positions and the formal forfeiture of his remaining property interests. He left Redstone Crossing on a Thursday morning in October, 2 deputies on either side, and the street was quiet when he went. Not the performed silence of a town watching its fallen patriarch with awe. The ordinary quiet of people going about their morning who happened to have nothing to say in that particular moment. Deputy Lyle Marsh resigned before the federal prosecutor's interview. The resignation was accepted, his badge was collected, and he was informed that accepting the resignation did not constitute immunity from the federal questioning that would follow. He cooperated fully with the federal questioning. He left for Kansas City the following month, and Rose heard nothing further about him. The Council of Redstone Crossing met in emergency session on the Wednesday after the arrests and spent 4 hours in documented disarray about the practical question of how to govern a town whose governance structure had been so thoroughly entwined with the coal enterprise that removing the coals left gaps in every committee and most of the formal processes. They emerged from the session with a provisional arrangement, and the specific chastened energy of people who had spent years assuming the infrastructure would always be there, and were now discovering what it actually consisted of. Rose was asked to attend 2 of the subsequent council sessions as a representative of the federal postal designation, which required her to sit at a table in the town hall, across from some of the same faces that had occupied the church pews during Carver's session. She sat there and did the work the function required, and she did not perform either forgiveness or resentment, and she gave the council the information they needed from the postal perspective, and she came back to the post office and operated the telegraph key and sorted the correspondence and did her work. This was, she found, the correct approach. Not because it required no effort, it required a specific kind of effort, the effort of continuing to engage with a community that had failed her, while holding simultaneously the knowledge of the failure and the determination not to be defined by it in either direction, not defined by bitterness and not defined by the performance of recovery. Just present, just doing the function. Samuel moved into the room above the hardware store on the 1st of October. Mrs. Garfield's coffee was indeed medicinal, a fact he reported with the specific understatement of someone describing a field condition. He kept his trade schedule, going up to the San Juans for the autumn pull and coming back down with the furs and the provisions and the particular unhurried quality of a man who now had a reason to come back that was additional to the commercial ones. He came into the post office most mornings, sometimes with outgoing correspondence, sometimes not. He sat in the chair on the customer side of the counter, not the chair inside the counter that was her working position, but the chair she'd put there for customers who needed to wait, which she'd moved to a slightly different position that she preferred, and which he occupied with the ease of someone who understood that this was the correct chair for him in this particular configuration of the room. They talked. About the work, about the town's ongoing recalibration, about the things coming through the telegraph that gave the daily picture of a world that extended past the San Juan Basin in every direction. She told him what she was seeing in the correspondence, and he told her what he was seeing in the terrain, and between the 2 readings they generally had a reasonable account of what was actually happening. She read Doc Taft's letter in mid-October, on a Tuesday evening after closing when the post office was quiet, and she had the particular quality of attention that the letter required. It was 4 pages. He described, in the medical language she'd expected, but also in something more personal underneath it, what he'd seen when she'd come into his examination room, and what he'd done, and what he'd told himself about why. He described his son's debt and the mechanism of the threat and the specific sequence of choices he'd made in the moments when Doyle Cole had stood in the doorway of the examination room and looked at him. He described what it felt like to write the signed statement for Samuel, the specific quality of doing the thing he should have done 23 days earlier. He described leaving Redstone Crossing and what he was going to do next, which was to go to a town in eastern Colorado where they needed a doctor and where nobody knew his history, and to do the work correctly and continue doing it correctly until the work itself became his record rather than the thing he'd done in one examination room on one Thursday in August. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He said he didn't expect it and wouldn't claim it if offered. He said he hoped she was well in the physical sense, meaning the wounds. And then he said he hoped she was well in the other sense too. And he knew the other sense was harder and took longer. And he was sorry he'd been part of the reason it needed to take longer at all. She folded the letter and put it in the bottom drawer of the supply cabinet. Not the false bottom drawer where her father had kept the deed. The regular bottom drawer, the one for things that were worth keeping but didn't require concealment. She wasn't ready to forgive Warren Taft. She might not reach ready. But she could recognize that a person who writes 4 honest pages at cost to themselves about the choice they made in the worst moment of their professional life is a different kind of person than the one who made that choice, and that the difference mattered, even if it didn't change what the choice had been. Samuel was waiting outside when she locked the post office that evening. He had 2 horses, which meant he'd been planning to suggest a ride out toward the canyon before it got full dark, which was something they'd been doing on the evenings when the work allowed and the weather was right. She locked the door and came down the step and looked at the horses and at him. "Taft's letter," she said. "I know," he said. He'd seen it in the morning mail, and he'd known when she brought it into the back room that she'd read it that evening. "He's going to keep practicing medicine." "Yes, I think that's the right outcome," she said. "Not because he deserves it, because the alternative is a doctor who stops practicing because of shame, and the people in his next town need a doctor more than the shame needs to be satisfied." Samuel looked at her. "That's a generous reading. It's a practical reading," she said. "I've been spending a lot of time on the difference between the two." She took the reins of her horse. "My father would have said they're the same thing if you look long enough. Your father sounds like a man I would have wanted to argue with," Samuel said. "He would have loved it," she said. He thought people who didn't argue back weren't paying attention. They rode out toward the canyon in the October evening, the light doing the specific thing it did in Colorado at that hour and that altitude. Warm and low-angled and impossibly detailed, picking out every feature of the terrain with the particular clarity of late-season light that seemed to be paying its final respects to everything it touched before the winter came. The mountains stood in every direction. The stamp mill was winding down for the evening shift. Behind them, Redstone Crossing was going about the business of an ordinary Tuesday in October, which was, she thought about this, what ordinary felt like now. Ordinary felt like this. The town, the work, the evening ride, the man beside her who had revising his schedule and was not finished with the revision. It was not uncomplicated. The complications were real and would continue to be real. The council members who'd been in Cole's orbit and were finding their way to different positions. The town's economic structure that was reorganizing around the absence of the thing that had organized it. The people who came into the post office and managed their discomfort about her differently on different days. The ongoing presence of what had happened at Miller's Creek in the record of everything that followed it. But she was here. The post office was open. The designation was secure. The telegraph key was operational and the correspondence was moving, and the function that her father had dedicated his life to was continuing under her hands, which were steady and capable, and had sent the telegram that had changed the ground conditions of everything. That was the shape of it. Not a clean arc with a resolved ending. A continuation with everything that had happened incorporated into it. Not erased, not transcended, just carried forward into the work that was always going to be the point. She would think about this later. In the first weeks of December, when the first real snow came down from the peaks, and the mountain was white and closed for the season, and the post office was warm inside with the small iron stove going, and the correspondence coming in that always increased in winter. People writing the things they'd been meaning to write since summer. She would think about what her father had understood that she was still learning. That public trust wasn't a building or a designation or a federal charter. It was a practice. It was the daily decision to do the function honestly regardless of who needed it or what it cost, or whether anyone was watching. It was the refusal to be purchased or pressured or worn down into something less than what the function required. It was the assumption that every piece of correspondence that came through the door mattered to someone, and that the person it mattered to deserved to have it handled with the same care as every other piece. Because the post office was the connective tissue of a community's honest life, and that was worth protecting. She'd lost 23 days to the proof of what happened when it wasn't protected. She'd gotten back everything that could be gotten back, and she was carrying the rest forward. On the morning of the following spring, Rose stood at the counter before opening and looked at the new calendar on the wall. March 1882, the San Juan peak still white on the card's illustration, and felt the quality of the morning as its own thing, rather than as a position in a sequence of events she was managing. Samuel knocked at the back door. Two quick, one slow. She had the bolt off before the second knock finished, the motion of someone who knew the knock so well the body responded before the mind caught up. And he came in with coffee from Mrs. Garfield's above the hardware store. 2 cups, which he'd been bringing every morning since November, and set one on the counter beside her position and took his on the customer side. Snow off the pass yesterday, he said. The eastern approach is clearing. Another 2 weeks and the trail is clean enough to start the spring run. The spring run is now bringing things back up the mountain instead of only bringing you down, Rose said. There are things worth bringing both directions, he said, in the way of a man who had decided something and was living inside the decision. He picked up the morning's first incoming telegram from the pending tray and handed it across the counter with the ease of someone who'd been part of the daily operation long enough to know how it moved. She took it, began preparing the routing slip. Outside Redstone Crossing was starting its Tuesday, the stamp mill beginning its rhythm, the boardwalk filling with the morning traffic, the town that had failed her and was now doing the work of being better at itself, imperfectly, daily, because that was the only way anything was ever actually done. She thought about the dime her father had left in the bottom of the supply cabinet. She thought about the note under the counter, the one she'd carved in the last hour of the last day before she'd gone out the back door and up the mountain, small letters clear. If someone hurt you and no one will listen, stay. Say it again. Someone will come. She hadn't put her name on it. It wasn't for her. It was for whoever stood at this counter next, whoever found themselves in the position of holding a true thing in a room that was deciding not to hear it, a small piece of infrastructure built to outlast the moment that required it. Her father would have understood. She stamped the routing slip, operated the key. The message went out into the wire and moved at the speed that had always seemed miraculous to her, south through the circuit toward Denver and wherever beyond, carrying the honest, ordinary information of a Tuesday in a Colorado mining town to the people who'd been waiting for it. The bell above the door chimed. The first customer of the morning came in for their mail. Rose looked up from the key and said good morning, and the day continued.